Es para mí hoy estar aquí un honor, acompañada por la vicerrectora de Globalización de la Universitat Oberta de Cataluña, Pastora Martínez, a mi derecha, y por John Mercer, catedrático de Masculinidad y Sexualidad en la Universidad Central de Birmingham. Bien, ayer tuvimos la ocasión de compartir unos momentos con Jeff Hearn y hablar de masculinidades, y también tuvimos oportunidad de compartir con las personas del Centro de Cultura Contemporánea de Barcelona, en el que ahora nos encontramos, sus impresiones respecto a lo que estaba sucediendo. Y todas y todos estuvimos de acuerdo en que lo que estaba sucediendo ayer, y esperamos que suceda estos próximos días, con el interés que despiertan las masculinidades, es algo reciente. Yo puedo dar fe de que es reciente, porque cuando yo en los años 90 estudiaba la homosexualidad masculina, yo estaba convencida de que estaba haciendo antropología del género, pero era la única que creía que estaba haciendo antropología del género, porque nadie entendía entonces que la masculinidad en este país, quiero decir, que la masculinidad y la homosexualidad masculina pudieran ser género, ¿no? Y me costó, la verdad, bastante el convencer en muchos congresos, por ejemplo, a la organización, de que me pusieran en simposios de género o de urbana y no en simposios de medicina. Tuve la suerte, en cambio, os cuento el AZ y el ENVES, tuve la suerte, en cambio, de que al acabar la tesis el Institut Valencià d'Estudis i Investigacions de la Generalitat de Valenciana y la Diputació de Valencia me otorgara un proyecto que llamé entonces Clases de Hombres y que duró 3 años y que lamentablemente por mi situación personal y profesional en aquellos momentos no produjo entonces ninguna publicación. Bien, aquello era una historia. Ahora estamos en otra historia, ahora estamos en la 5ª edición, y repito, la 5ª, del Men in Movement. Y os quiero dar pues, unas pequeñas claves sobre cómo se originó este proyecto y por qué pusimos en marcha este proyecto. Bien, en 2015, en la Universitat Oberta de Cataluña, en la que yo estoy trabajando, estaban trabajando conmigo Paco Abril, Cristian Nardini, personas, miembros del comité de organización y sin las cuales esta conferencia sería imposible, pero además personas reconocidas en el campo de las masculinidades. Y nos encontramos con bueno, las ganas, ¿no?, de hacer algo para situar finalmente las masculinidades como un elemento fundamental e imprescindible en la discusión sobre el género. Aprovechando una convocatoria de la Caixa, que yo esto cada vez que presentaba un Men in Movement decía, bueno, algún defecto tiene que tener el Men in Movement, ha estado financiado años por un banco, ¿eh? Pero bueno, aprovechando una ayuda de la Caixa, Internationalization at Home, solicité una subvención para crear esta conferencia, que fue aceptada y que además se vio respaldada por mi universidad, la Universitat Oberta de Cataluña. ¿Qué es lo que nosotros queríamos? Nosotros principalmente queríamos 2 cosas. Queríamos poner las masculinidades en la agenda pública como, ya he comentado, parte imprescindible de las relaciones de género, pero además queríamos tender puentes no solo con la sociedad general, sino entre la academia y el activismo, porque estábamos convencidas de que o nos ponemos a trabajar todas remando en la misma dirección, o el cambio y la transformación, que es tan urgente, son difíciles. Y estas son las 2 cuestiones que están en el ADN de esta conferencia. En 2015 celebramos la primera edición, tuvimos éxito. En 2016 celebramos la segunda edición en colaboración con la Universidad de Roma. En 2017 celebramos la tercera edición otra vez aquí en Barcelona. En el 19 la hicimos en Bérgamo y este MIM, que es el acrónimo al que hoy asistimos, como todas podéis imaginar, estaba previsto para 2020. Es decir, es un many movement que llevamos organizando prácticamente 2 años. Pero bueno, la buena noticia es que finalmente estamos aquí para abordar el estudio crítico de las masculinidades como lo que es y debe ser como una urgencia social, porque el género no es un problema de las mujeres. El género, la desigualdad de género y la igualdad de género es un problema de todas. Por tanto, creemos que el proyecto de cambio en el que estamos embarcadas y del que estas conferencias son parte es un proyecto común que nos tiene que implicar a todas. Esta conferencia, como he comentado, hubiera sido imposible sin la colaboración de diferentes entidades, organizaciones y personas. Obviamente, mi primer agradecimiento es para la Universitat Oberta de Catalunya i els Estudis Humanitats y el grupo de recerca Medusa, del que muchas personas que lo formamos estamos aquí. Ya lo dije ayer, pero lo quiero repetir, quiero dar particularmente las gracias a Gloria Pujol, a Marta Batalla y a Raquel Herrera, sin cuya asistencia esto sería muchísimo más complicado. El CCCB ha mostrado su compromiso y su interés por este tema y ayer nos coorganizó la sesión inaugural, por tanto corresponde también darle un agradecimiento en público. Homes Igualitaris AIG nos viene colaborando, porque ya he dicho que en el ADN de esta conferencia está tender puentes y remar en la misma dirección desde la primera edición, y su compromiso, su ayuda y su saber y sus saberes son imprescindibles, ¿no? Contamos también desde hace un año con una complicidad con la Red Europea de Masculinidades, Sexo y Cultura Popular, MASNET, cuyo director es John Mercer, y con quien organizamos la semana pasada un congreso sobre masculinidades en tiempos de cambio que se realizó online, que igual tuvisteis oportunidad de asistir a alguna sesión, y con quienes también coorganizamos la mesa redonda final que tendrá lugar mañana a las 6 de la tarde sobre el futuro de las masculinidades. Contamos también con el apoyo y la financiación del Instituto de las Mujeres y con la colaboración del grupo de la Universitat de Barcelona Construyendo Masculinidades. Por supuesto, es momento ahora también de agradecer su compromiso y entusiasmo a todas las personas ponentes y, por supuesto, a todas las personas que hemos participado en la organización de este acto: Cristian Ardini, Paco Abril, Alexandre Pichel. Bien, ayer hablaba Jeff de las masculinidades cómplices. Comentábamos sobre las etiquetas de las masculinidades y yo particularmente comentaba que tenemos miles de etiquetas híbridas, no híbridas, dominantes, alternativas, hegemónicas, tóxicas, saturadas. Y Jeff hizo referencia a una etiqueta que generalmente olvidamos nombrar, que es la de las masculinidades cómplices, no en el sentido de Connell, del complicit masculinities, es decir, aquellos que, obteniendo el dividendo patriarcal, colaboran en el sostenimiento de la subordinación del otro, sino cómplices como aliadas. Bien, que sea esta una conferencia y una relación permanente que nos sirva para establecer estas complicidades. Gracias. Y le doy paso ahora la palabra a John.
Hello, everybody. I'm going to speak English. You wouldn't understand me if I spoke Spanish, so there would be little points. My concession to Spanish this is I've got my handbag here, just like Belén Esteban would if she was sitting on the stage, ready to go. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm really, really proud to have this involvement with Begonia and with many movements. Me and Begonia have been working very closely on a research network that takes place in the UK, well, across Europe, in fact, funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council in Britain. The research network is called Masculinities, Sex and Popular Culture. We have a book series as well, We're always on the lookout for interesting titles, so if anybody here has an idea for a book, please do let me know. That's my advertisement out of the way. Our research network really has been about drawing together colleagues from across disciplines, from across Europe and the wider world, in fact, whose research is about masculinity, but outside of the realms of the social sciences, so humanities researchers who are involved in masculinities research, arts researchers who are involved in masculinities research. This is the third and final one of the series of events that is going to be taking place under the aegis of our research network. So we really wanted the culmination of the network to take place in coincidence with men in movement. So we're really proud that that's happening. We're really excited that's happening. And if you want to come along on Friday evening, you can be introduced to the rest of the steering group of our network, and you can hear us talk about what we think priorities are for masculinities research in future, and what kind of plans we can make to work together to make that research a reality. Thank you very much, Begonia.
Well, so thank you. Good morning, bon dia, buenos días. Moltíssimes gràcies, Begoña. Per mi és un plaer estar avui aquí, ho saps, però ho voldria explicitar, i moltíssimes gràcies al grup Medusa, perquè no només per tota la part de generació de coneixement, sinó també per l'activisme dins i fora de la universitat que tant necessitem. Agrair també a totes les institucions que ja ha citat Begoña que fan possible aquest esdeveniment i sobretot a totes les persones que ho han estat fent possible. Thank you very much to all participants for being here and coming to Barcelona in such times that is not at all easy to travel. And also thank you to all of you that are following us by streaming wherever you are. What time is it? Thanks a lot. Yo quería destacar dos aspectos por el papel que me toca aquí representando una institución como es una universidad. Primero, la importancia de que pasen eventos como este, ya la 5ª edición del Men in Movement, muchos años atrás empezó, como nos explicaba Begoña, por la importancia de la temática, por lo que abordan, ¿no? Nos lo explicaba muy bien Begoña, pero yo que ahora tengo también el privilegio de ser la presidenta de la Unidad de Igualdad de la UOC, que hemos estado trabajando mucho, somos conscientes de que se ha puesto mucho el foco en todo lo que es el estudio de uno de los roles de género, quizá descuidando el otro, ¿no? Y como ya, bueno, sois mucho más expertos que yo, no voy a entrar ahí, pero sí que animaros a seguir en esta vía creando y generando esas complicidades que decíamos antes para poder avanzar entre todos. También por cómo lo abordáis este congreso, este encuentro, ¿no? Tejiendo complicidades precisamente, tendiendo puentes, que decís en vuestra nota de concepto, entre la academia y el activismo. En la UOC tenemos muy claro que el conocimiento no está solo en la academia ya y que, por tanto, es imprescindible contar con todas las personas, ¿no?, que están interesadas en mover hacia allí. Y yo solo quería acabar con un aspecto que es importante para mí, que es las responsabilidades de la academia también, las responsabilidades de la universidad como institución, apostando por generar y compartir un conocimiento no androcéntrico que nos permita eso, el movimiento y la acción a ir más allá. Y en una universidad con mandato público como la nuestra también debe estar implicada en generar esa acción, ¿no?, de mejorar nuestro entorno. O sea que primero un compromiso con nuestra comunidad universitaria, ¿no?, en la importancia de hacer y no solo decir, que bueno, empecemos por el decir, pero también hagamos, y después el resto de comunidades también, que como universidades tenemos que ser muy conscientes que damos ejemplo, y ese ejemplo se demuestra hoy aquí, en el qué y en el cómo. Muchísimas gracias, Begoña, moltíssimes gràcies per estar aquí. Thank you very much. And yeah, that's it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you to you all. it's impossible to do this without the complicity of many people. And thank you particularly to you for being here and for what it means about, what it says about our university and its commitment with social change. Thank you. Buenos días.
Hello and good morning. Good morning, one and all. We're gonna start today's dialogue of this international conference entitled Men in Movement. Today, we're going to be exploring the relationship between gender, masculinity, and politics in a broad sense, yet deeply grounded on the reality that we have to endure. I am extremely happy and willing to listening to the two amazing researchers, a politologist and an historian, and I am sure that both perspectives will help us better understand this relationship. Stephanie Meyer is a politologist focused on the critical research in extreme right-wing movements. She's also an expert in feminist politics and theory. Her PhD on racism and anti-racism in feminist white activism in Wien University. Well, the research was published in German in 2018. Ever since, she has been working as a professor and a researcher in the Wien Applied Science University. She's been part of the European research project E-Engagement Against Violence in Europe, exploring digital alphabetization against populism. In the last few years, her research has focused on movements, anti-feminist movements, and in the intersection between racism, homophobia, and racism, and in the anti-gender campaigns. Her most recent article, was published with Emma Jonovic and other peers. Women, family, and the extreme right-wing movements in Austria, published in the Gabriela Budze book. Today, together with Judith Goetz, she is working on a volume on anti-feminism from a global perspective that is to be published by Edinburgh University Press. Stephanie, many thanks for being here and joining this debate. And thanks for having traveled all the way from Austria to Barcelona. Gemma Torres is a doctor in history by Universitat de Barcelona and a professor on contemporary history of UB. Her research interest focuses on post-colonial studies and gender studies, more specifically on masculinity. She's been part of several research and development projects on tourism and gender, amongst others. Her most recent research is based on the relationship between nation and masculinity and on the research of historic forms of alternative masculinities. She's published Nation and Masculinity, Colonialism in Morocco, and with Marian Ash, she's published The Limits of Difference, Cultural Alterity, Gender and Social Practices, as well as Feminisms in Transition. More recently, she published The Virile Nation and other chapters, Subversive Masculinity, The Vulnerable Men, Gender, Nation and Imperium in the Spain of centuries 19 and 20. Okay, well, I'm extremely pleased of having you amongst us, Gemma. Thanks for being here. So, having said that, I would like to say that it's not a secret that gender and politics go hand in hand, and they are acting as classification systems that are mutually reinforcing through mechanisms that can be considered, be it brutal or subtle. As it was said yesterday, masculinity has been a norm that has not always been visible, so it's very good news that we start shedding light on it and exploring on it, and whether there is a relationship between gender and masculinity, and to what extent we can try and change them if we consider it necessary. Now, regarding politics and nationalism, articles focused on masculinity or focused on the relationship between gender and politics were developed only at the beginning of the 90s. It was back then when we started stating that all nations are gender projects, MOSE, and that they are gendered, or that gender and nation are undetachable, such as well-recognized thinkers acknowledge. The majority of existing works underline the existence of differentiated gender roles in regards to national identity, considering men as nations defenders and women as nations reproducers. All this is based on an interpretation of biology which is extremely determinist and old-fashioned. And today, like in the past, and I don't know if you will agree with me, this interpretation of biology is being used politically. It could not be otherwise, right? Nations have always thought about themselves as masculine, as sovereign, as powerful, as aggressive. Like men, and Timmel explains it very well, nations consider that they have rights per se, that they are in danger of being, let's say, then there's movements such as men going the wrong way, Proud Boys, etc. They are, let's say, intermingling with extreme right-wing movements in the US and also in Europe, and of course here in Spain also. To focus on this topic, I really like to speak about muscular nationalism, which I believe allows us to rethink and better understand how gender and politics reinforces each other. As a result of that, feminism and nationalism have been considered as antagonic theoretical movements. I would like to discuss all these points, I would like to raise all these points with you to better dig into the idea of how gender and politics are being polarized and are contributing to a wider polarization of social debate, and thus shaping today public policies. But of course, they shaped past policies, even if we have not necessarily paid attention to this fact in the past. So I would like to start by drafting a general framework, and I would like to know if, from your perspective, it makes sense to speak about gender and politics, or to put it differently, can we speak about politics without referring to gender? And here I'm not referring to quotas, of course. None of us like quotas, right? We're in a different mental framework. So in your research and in your experience, to what extent are politics and gender related? Do you think, of course I know you do, but do you think we need to bear in mind both concepts in your research, and why? And I would like to know also, what ideas do you consider to be most interesting in order to carry out an activist exploration and an activist research on the relationship between masculinity and politics and what could be considered national matters that somehow seem to be and to have been attached to gender. Can I start by referring to the past? Of course, indeed. Go ahead. Okay, thank you very much, Begonia, and thanks for having invited me to Men in Movement, which is a very important international gathering. I'm very happy to be here. I had attended the conference previously, but as an audience, right? I'm gonna put my historian hat on to share a few examples with you, which I believe might be useful to rethink the concepts that we have raised. The relationship between masculinity and politics is, from my perspective, sound. I mean, in the field of history, a lot has been said regarding to what extent historians that focus on the history of states, nations, and class cannot not take into account gender and more specifically masculinity. Begoña, you have already mentioned the following idea, but of course, the idea that has been, let's say, developed by so many researchers explaining the intrinsic relationship between masculinity and other social realities which seem to be exempt from gender, right? Masculinity has to do with a personal identity of individuals, of some individuals, but masculinity is also a shared social value, and we all contribute to its definition, we all feed its definition. You've referred to two ways of understanding masculinity: minimalism, which is a masculinity contraposed to women, and a maximalist interpretation which aims at understanding to what extent masculinity-related values and masculine ideals contribute to developing and sustaining other social hierarchies which are not related to sexual difference. That would be class differences, national differences, the development of liberal states, to give you a few examples. So, historically, there's been a close relationship between both concepts, of course, but it's been a long process that started at the beginning of the 19th century in an interrelated manner. Yesterday, Begoña asked herself whether this pro-masculine reaction is a response to feminism or whether it comes back from the past. And from my views, it's not like masculinity has a long tradition, it's just that it's a root cause and it's the origin of the way we understand the world today. For example, the development of liberal states at the beginning of the 19th century. I'm not gonna be long regarding historic examples because I don't want to be long. But of course, this cannot be understood without bearing in mind masculinity. How were citizens defined? Who had citizenship rights? Well, those who had certain qualities such as strength, physical strength, and bravery to defend nations through arms and defending liberty. And that's how virility was attached to citizenship rights. And this, of course, meant, well, this applied to men, but not only to men, because some women fought, or many women, all women, fought against absolutism and for freedom. And they wanted to take part in the development of these values that forge liberal states by using viril values, but at the same time they incarnated the ideal of freedom against absolutism. And it's very difficult to make a distinction between masculinity and this revolutionary ideal. Then there was a process in which women's participation in liberal fights was banned, and women were expelled and banned and neglected of their citizenship rights. And the same happens with class differences. At the beginning of the 20th century, there was a debate on poverty in cities. What was the main cause of poverty in cities from a bourgeois perspective? Well, the bourgeois considered that poverty was the result of men spending all the money in alcohol, prostitution, gambling, the fact that they didn't work, that they were just weak, right? So they were not masculine enough from the bourgeois perspective, from the bourgeois masculine ideal. So in these examples we can see to what extent this narrative on masculinity does not refer to men's identity, in fact, but whether it refers to the state, to class differences, to class privileges, and perhaps about nation also. Yesterday, Herm referred to the fact that fish do not develop their theories about water. Fish don't see the water, they swim around, or they swim in or through. So the same happens with us humans. Masculinity is not only related to politics, it's 100% let's say, it penetrates all concepts that we have developed in the last few years, even decades and centuries. It's like water. Masculinity is like, the analogy is, masculinity is like the water in which fish swim and they can't see. I believe it's a very interesting analogy because for the first time, I mean, it's not happening for the first time, right? What you are describing is not happening today, and it's not a reaction against a contemporary phenomena. It's the basis of the way we have developed our society. So the problem is that we haven't been able, or we have not have the tools to raise awareness, to put light and thus visibilize the impact that masculinity has had on our lives and on our societies. Of course, there is a lack of visibility because masculinity is the norm of human development, not only the nation or the state, but human. Stephanie, let me switch to you. So, what is your experience about this relationship between masculinity and politics? How are you working on it? How do you see the articulation between gender, masculinity, and politics? You, from the more, let's say, politological perspective, because you focus on extreme right populism in Central Europe, so we can't wait to hear your perspective. Thank you.
So, okay, sorry for the delay. I had to wait for the translation. Let me say, first of all, I'm really so happy to be here after this 1.5 years of only looking at little screens. So, really, thanks a lot for the invitation. Thanks also a lot for the perfect organization of all my travels. Yeah, so thanks for having me here, and thanks for the very nice introduction. Yeah, I'm a political scientist and a gender studies scholar, and I would like to talk a little bit about the failure of a lot of gender studies research, which is very much my own failures. So I'm one of those who come a bit kind of late to the party, who have been late to pick up that thinking about masculinities is an absolute necessity if we want to think about gender as a relational concept, not as something that pertains to women. And I think gender scholars in general are quick to agree on, yes, gender is a relational concept, but it's much less clear what this means when you spell it out in research, when your research needs to focus on masculinities as well as femininities. And I would like to start with a little story. It's a true story. It's already a few years old. A colleague of mine was doing some really fascinating research on day traders, and one of the things he came up with was how these people sexualized the market when they talked about it, like the market is a bitch, the market is something they have to conquer, stuff like this. And when I said, well, you have to look at it from a gender perspective, he was like, no, you know, I can't do that. I wasn't able to interview any women. So, yeah. This is a true story, and it was kind of something that got me thinking that even though I found in this example it was so much in your face, it was so clear that masculinities was what needed thinking about here, but in many other instances I myself was not up to the task to really work with gender as a relational concept. So I hope you excuse me for talking about myself for a little time. I came to gender studies, to gender research, to gender perspectives in political science around the mid-1990s, when, at least in German-speaking academia, deconstruction of gender was the new hot thing, the new hot issue that everybody was talking about still. It's a bit of a time lag when the debates from the US kind of swapped over to German-speaking academia. And at that time, of course, we would have had all the theoretical concepts, all the frameworks in place to really understand gender as a relational concept, to really think through femininities and masculinities. But still, the debates that were really going on were very much focused on women, on the deconstruction of gender might kill feminism. We cannot talk about women anymore. We are not allowed to form sentences in the first person plural to talk about the we, the feminist we anymore. This was kind of what was going on at the time. And I have to admit, I very much bought into that. And I also was very much thinking, well, if mainstream political science is 95% about men, then I'm going to be critical, I'm doing the other stuff, I will focus on women. And I did not get for quite a long time what I was losing with that one-sided focus. So I think that's kind of a backstory here. And that, I think, keeps gender studies, keeps gender perspectives from fulfilling their full potential, from really getting the importance they need to get in the social sciences in general and in political science especially. So I think a little bit of my backstory here and why I'm also so keen on this conference and to learn from you over the coming days. I'm really sorry I couldn't be here yesterday, but it was not possible because of flights. Yeah. So in practice, the debates, even though we had the theoretical framework in place, very much was still centered on women. Feminist research very much was still research on women, on femininity, on constructions of femininity, and then deconstructing that. And I believe we still see echoes of that today, for example, in the debates about trans persons, trans rights, and the debates about are these people female enough to qualify as women, whatever that should mean in a deconstructivist framework. So I see the problem more on the level of actual research than on the level of theoretical frameworks, but I think it's still an important problem here. And especially in political science, which is very much the study of power relations, their gender, of course, has to be an important concept, has to be one important analytical concept, but it's incomplete if it doesn't take into account masculinities. Yeah, so that's kind of where I come from. I wanted to share that with you in the beginning. What I believe, and it's also been talked about a little bit in the introduction, is that it keeps us from really seeing the relational character of gender, and it very much keeps in place a framework that still accepts masculinity as a norm from which all other genders deviate, from which all other genders can be judged from. Of course, we have a lot of critical and analytical work from a variety of perspectives that challenges this view. I'm not trying to negate that, but I think in the mainstream of gender studies, if you look at the program of gender studies conferences, it's still very much a marginalized concept. And it's also, I think, and this is where the politics come in, this invisibility of masculinity is still something that also shapes our day-to-day lives, shapes politics in a very real sense. To use one small example, if you look at Germany, the elections there, Angela Merkel, it doesn't matter how women live their femininity, how they construct it, it will always be a public issue, not so much with men, not so much with masculinity. So I think this is where the critical impetus lies of looking at masculinity in relation to politics and of fulfilling the potential of gender studies in relation to politics.
Okay, I was going to speak in English. Stephanie,
thank you very much. In the context of the research that you carry out in your research group, so what impact does this gender approach have on the research that you produce when you take this gender approach? Because of course you are a key research group to move forward in the relationship between gender and contemporary politics or policies. So of course, your scope, your perspective has an impact and allows you probably to raise awareness about the relationships that exist and that if you took another scope, you would not be able to see, right?
So I'm studying right-wing extremist, right-wing populist parties and groups from a gender-critical perspective, and very much on the level of discourses and analysis of ideologies. So that's more where I come from. So another trajectory would be, of course, to look at actors, to look at who does what in these movements, in these groups. And we see some work there being done, especially on the male leadership of right-wing extremist, right-wing populist parties, on the way they construct masculinities, on what they represent or symbolize, also to their followers. On the other hand side, we see quite a lot of research on another group of actors, which would be voters, where we also see that there's more research coming out focusing on what gender, what masculinity has to do with the attraction to these parties and groups. And we see a lot of ambivalences there. So I think that's one interesting side, but it's not the one I'm mainly working on. What's important from my perspective is to try to think more of it, not so much in terms of femininity and masculinity, but more in terms of gender relations and how these gender relations are constructed in ideologies, programmatics, discourse on a broader level. And what we see there is a strong tendencies to revive even more unequal relationship between genders. And what we see is that under the guise of going back to some distant past that's never quite well defined, we see a lot of authoritarian tendencies, and we see a lot of strengthening of unequal power relations within the family, but then also, well, that's mainly a thing for right-wing conservatives, which is my new kind of field of study, not so much right-wing extremists, but right-wing conservatives, so kind of trying to move through the ideological spectrum there. And especially with right-wing extremist groups, we see a re-masculinization of the public sphere, at least in their ideas, in their ideological ideas, which is, I think, one of the most interesting points of analysis at the moment.
Muchas gracias. A ver,
Thank you very much. I don't want to forget about the concept of remasculinization that you've mentioned, because it has to do with the second block of items that we have designed. So please remind me if I skip the concept. In the last years, we have been working with concepts that target towards gender being a political element, right? Homo-nationalism or femo-nationalism by Sarah Faris, where the relationship between gender or it is clearly seen that gender is used as a political tool to produce exclusion processes. During the preparation of this conference, we had been discussing about hyper-masculinization processes that take place by making a clear difference between one group and another, which are racialized, different. So the impact that this has is to make sure that our masculinity, our aggressive and violent masculinity is justified, our racist masculinity is justified, right? So that both from an historic perspective and in today's policies, there is a group of significance that do not operate in an isolated manner, but rather in a chain, right? Gender, fundamentalism, white supremacism, which of course have turned in what we call ethno-nationalism. So from your experience, are we attending a re-masculinization process or a hyper-masculinization process, and to what extent such exclusion mechanisms operate and what political consequence does this have? Gemma, would you like to start? Give us the historical framework and then we dig into the political side of things. Thank you very much. I believe that the idea of hyper-masculinization that Stephanie pointed out is very important. Nonetheless, it's nothing new. In my research, and I'm not going to be long regarding the item or the point that I'm going to raise now, but let me give you an example that I believe is quite illustrative. In my research on the Franco initial period during the 20s, where the fascist political culture developed. Well, I've carried out a research on that in the framework of African imperialism in Morocco, where a group of men that then led the coup against the republic, well, they developed their political culture back there in the north of Africa, and this political culture was defined as hyper-masculine. And in this context, there are many processes that are very similar to the ones that we could observe today. On the one hand, Franco and all his troops and this cohesion group that was developed in Africa, well, one of the main elements of their group identity is masculine identity. In what sense? Well, they define themselves as men with the necessary qualities, with the strength, with the wildness, with an irrational masculinity, very outgoing and irrational masculinity. And they consider to be the only ones that, thanks to their special features, they will be able to save Spain. So there's a first relationship between masculinity, right, which is not only in comparison with femininity, but in comparison with the nation, in comparison with metropolitan coward men, and a decaying country, and a decaying Spain. Then there's a parallel political phenomena which is very interesting to underline, and that is that the fascist political project that was to be developed or was being developed considers, when we assess their texts, they define a Spain that has to be strong, a winner, brave. These are the values that they consider Spain should have. Spain, I mean, all fascisms do not speak about prosperity or development or citizens' well-being. No, they represent nations as a man. Nations end up acquiring masculine features, and it's even represented as a man from an imaginary perspective. So the process through which a nation ends up being represented as a man with certain values related to masculinity is very important and dangerous, because it allows to bring on board more and more people into a reactionary political project. Individuals acknowledge such values as something normal, that they identify and resonate with, and thus they come on board more easily through these ideals of masculinity. They adhere to a reactionary political project that goes beyond masculinity. For example, one of the main features of this masculine representation of the fascist nation is precisely that they consider political pluralism as a form of femininity. Democracy, political pluralism, and all these internal debates are considered to be feminine. They consider that Spain has to be based on masculine values, united and strong. So through masculinity, which has been undermined, which is something that, you know, is in the everyday life of people, that this is the framework in which reactionary values are little by little accepted, and perhaps this is happening today also. So Stephanie, of course, will answer if this is happening today also with extreme right-wing movements. But let me I am sure that Stephanie will dig into what I'm going to say now later. Begoña talked about femi-nationalism, homo-nationalism, and I believe that we have to speak about masco-nationalism in the sense that sometimes masculinity is being used to differentiate communities. Masculinity serves to build your own masculine identity and to differentiate yourself from others. In my case, in my research case, I focus the whole thing on an imperial context. Part of the fascist narrative includes the representation of foreign men as a very aggressive masculinity with no national identity. They just fight because they are savage, because they like blood, whereas Spaniards are also hyper-masculine, but they fight for a higher cause, which is a national ideal. So Africans are represented as hyper-masculine yet feminine. They have anal sex, they are weak, so this, let's say, comparison between groups of men is very important to understand the movement. And I believe this is also happening today. Let me share one anecdote, and I'm going to conclude very quickly. I had the occasion of carrying out a research about how the press represented or illustrated the street sellers in Barcelona. A couple of years ago there was a wave, so in the press they were represented or illustrated as black men, and they were illustrated as being a threat. And this dates from 3 years ago only. They consider that they were represented as aggressive by nature. I was really surprised about how the press was reproducing a racist narrative. And then there was a very interesting article that was published in a couple of media. One of these sellers, there was a picture of one of these sellers blocking a woman with a baby car. And you know, this is clearly the differentiation between the other, the threatening masculinity against the nation, represented by this mother, which is the perfect representation of the nation. So I believe that was extremely interesting and illustrative of how we are reproducing schemes from the past. I have the feeling, perhaps there will be time in the Q&A, but I don't know, I have the feeling that the ambivalence between the hyper-masculinization and at the same time the feminization of the racialized population could be a differential element between the before and the now, because the feminization of the racialized men, I have the feeling that today is not happening so much with racialized men, I'm saying. But of course, we can open a debate, we can think about it. Stephanie, the floor is yours, whenever you want to contribute about this last point. Thank you.
Yeah, it's so fascinating because I see such a lot of parallels and such a lot of points that are so true today, especially when you said that masculinity was used to draw different people, different parts of the population into a fascist movement. I have to make a quick detour to Austria. We have historically had two fascisms, Austro-Catholic fascism, then National Socialism, German national anti-Catholic, anti-clerical, and this has been a tradition that held quite fast till, I'd say, the 1990s, early 2000s even. And now, today, we see that anti-feminism and anti-gender mobilizations are one of the issues that brings these two camps together and that really is used to forge alliances across these ideological differences, across these deeply entrenched historical differences. So this is one of the things that very much resonated with the situation I see today in Austria, which might be, for historical reason, a little bit of a special case here. Yeah, of course, we see this hyper-masculinization of the other, of ethnicized, racialized men a lot. In the German-speaking cases, it's mostly directed against Muslim men that are depicted as aggressive, as dangerous, as a threat to our women, our white, Austrian, German, European women, yeah, So this again, we see this forging of the two groups here very, very clearly, and to me, it's always quite fascinating how openly this is articulated. If, for example, Bernd Höcke from the German AfD, Alternative for Germany, he said, we have to become wehrhaft, a German term, which means we have to become able to defend ourselves, but with a very aggressive overtone that doesn't really translate that well into English. So it's defending, but with a lot of aggression in it, directed against an enemy always. So it's very, very clearly spelled out what man should become or should be in terms of fulfilling their kind of national duty. And yeah, this is really tying together different strengths, different strands of the right wing, from Catholic conservative to the right-wing extremist spectrum, to neo-Nazi groups even. We have seen them marching together, which would have been unthinkable 20 years ago, but today they do really do protests together, for example, within these anti-gender mobilizations. So this is one thing that very much, I think, resonates today. And another thing you already pointed out is this necessity to look at this phenomena through an intersectional lens, because I think at the latest, at the moment you want to look at what effects this kind of discourses produce, it becomes absolutely necessary. Of course, the first effect is to legitimize racism. That's, I think, quite obvious, with calls for tighter immigration laws, for expulsions, and this focus on the other man, on their alleged aggressivity, natural, or it's a naturalization of culture, I would say, that is used to legitimate this kind of picture that is drawn here. It also serves to render ethnicized, racialized women invisible. So I think that's one of the things that's important here. The second thing it does, it of course legitimizes violence, it legitimizes this construction of an aggressive white Austrian European masculinity in order to defend our women. But this defense always comes, this kind of protection that's seemingly offered here, always comes at the expense of a need to accept male superiority. So that's a second effect, I think, that we need to talk about. And through this mechanism, by projecting sexism, gendered violence on others, it creates an image of us, of the in-group, as being emancipated, being a society of equality, and thereby delegitimizes and renders obsolete feminist claims and criticism. And that's, I think this last point is also one that we maybe should focus on more, that this seemingly pro-women stance is in effect a tool of an anti-feminist agenda. And this is, I think, one of my biggest quarrels with femo-nationalists, with feminist activists, feminist thinkers buying into this racist discourse, that they overlook this mechanism, that they do not see how detrimental this is, not only in terms of equality, not only in terms of not allowing society to become even more racist, but that it's also detrimental to all feminist claims. And I think that's also an important argument that we maybe need to make with even more force than we do today.
Muchísimas gracias. Creo que has planteado una...
Thank you very much. I believe you've raised very interesting ideas. I took due note of one very interesting idea, which is to what extent sometimes arguments or some narratives that are thought to be positive are in fact negative, right? And the idea of gender equality, I believe you said today, is being used politically in a very ambivalent scenario, right? So we need to define equality, because the way we understand equality differs depending on who you ask, right? So when certain groups speak about equality, from my perspective, it would be nothing. It would have nothing to do with equality. I'm thinking here about some debate groups or focus group carried out by a researcher about Vox, the extreme right-wing political party here in Spain, and I've had the chance also to participate in these working groups. And this political party, the members of this political party, declare themselves pro-gender equality and against gender violence. So the question is, how do you define equality? What is equality for you? This is the question, right? Because it's not only about the need to take an intersectional lens and a relational approach, not taking categories in silos, but rather mixing them and intermingling them and allowing them to flow and see what happens. We need to understand that all these categories are being deconstructed one by one, because there are some PC ways of speaking that, well, some fascist groups, Gemma used the word, and I believe we can use it, some fascist political groups are using concepts that in the past were used by the left wing, were used by activisms, by progressist ideologies, and now they use them to undermine them, to kill its legitimacy, or readapt them in benefit of their stakes, of their interests, and to position themselves in the democratic sphere. So it's quite dramatic, I would say. We're amidst a very complicated moment from an historic and political perspective. Now, to close the second block, the second debate block, I would like to raise another point. Probably we're speaking about one of the most difficult yet complicated items when, well, I ask myself, the remasculinization process. Well, first of all, we should question whether we're speaking about remasculinization or about cultural meanings of a deep misogyny that has shaped our societies. Or perhaps we're speaking about the revival of masculinity, as some authors say. What is the aim of this revival or this? So those that have always held power still hold it, right? It's perhaps also about redefining gender violence, gender relationships, that have been damaged by years and years of feminist claims and activism, and people that have fought for equality. Another question that I ask myself is, why again biology is considered a fixed mandate? Men are men and women are women, which are old-fashioned arguments. 15 years ago, no one would have dared using such argument. 15 years ago, no one spoke about biological determination from a political perspective, at least. And all of a sudden, it's back in the political agenda. And then the third item that I know we can't answer, but we need to think about anyway, is why these ideas are resonating in so many people and in such a powerful way, right? Why so many people buy these extreme right-wing ideas? Why? I mean, narratives and practices exist. They are disseminated, they are recirculated. But why so many people are buying these narratives? Why today? Why in the 21st century so many people resonate with such old-fashioned ideas? Of course, I'm not expecting an answer. It's just a reflection. I mean, you don't need to give me a final answer. You don't need to solve the problem today. Otherwise, it would be putting too much pressure on you, I guess. Why this revival of masculinity, or why this revival of hyper-masculinity? To be honest, I don't know. What I've been thinking recently, well, I've been thinking about the history of emotions, and as I said before, some narratives, some reactionary narratives in the past were I mean, from the history of emotions, we aim at better understanding individual experiences to try and avoid this top-down approach on the historic narrative, and thus understanding why nationalism or fascism attracted so many supporters. And I believe that emotions play a very important role. And that's why it's very interesting to understand the history of emotions. And I believe that gender-related emotions are especially efficient when it comes to mobilizing people. They are a key mobilization lever. In the case of fascism in the 20s and even today, the pleasure of exerting power, the pleasure of humiliating others, the pleasure of dominating, the exaltation of a joint cause or a joint struggle. All these elements turn into individual emotions with two aims. One, developing a masculine gender identity in a experimental way, and secondly, to adhere to a political project that today would be called a white nation project. So now, considering what's happening, or what happened in the Capitol in the US, I ask myself why all these people rushed into the Capitol, and not only men, also women. Why did they feel emotional all the way from their tiny states? They jumped on buses, drove for hours, they bought the whole thing, stripped out, it was very cold. So what's the point, right? What touched him, what moved him? Probably the pleasure of experiencing the masculine emotions, exaltation, domination, taking pleasure of humiliating others, that have to do with gender. Probably this produces some sort of pleasure, I guess, that has to do with the masculine identity and with a political project that goes far beyond. So this is an element that mobilizes, right? Because it has to do with the common sense of a traditional masculinity. It's much easier to move or to mobilize others from the sense. So I believe that this is the idea of, I don't know if it kind of says it, but it's the idea of how masculine emotions are used to produce a certain mobilization, as well as negative emotions such as hate towards others or disgust towards others, which are incorporated through gender identity, but that also involve a racist political project, a racist and supremacist political project, and they affect women also, because at the end of the day, we're speaking about values which are shared values. And Stephanie also referred to the readaptation of narratives. This is the way gender narratives are systematically being readapted, or they take new shapes and forms, in the sense that some groups consider themselves to be the main defenders of gender equality, and this makes us think about common sense-based models on which men are considered the protector. Thanks, Stephanie.
Okay, these have been so many so good questions, but I think I might be able to kind of build a link to what you just said about the emotions, which I believe is a very important point. I think one also emotional factor that plays a huge role is that this re-emergence, this re-masculinization, this re-emergence of anti-gender and anti-feminist movements has got to do, or is in part at least, an answer to broader insecurities that came about by social changes during the last decades, by precarization of all aspects of life. I think this is one important issue here. it's not only, so this is not an argument that it's the people that are in a socially disadvantaged position that are especially prone to these ideologies. That's definitely wrong, I think. We can say that with certainty. But still a feeling of insecurity is, I think, an important driver behind it. What came to my mind in an older project, I interviewed young activists from the youth organization of the right-wing extremist party, Freedom Party in Austria, and one of their most important things, the thing they really wanted to tell me was, yeah, well, with this group for the first time I'm feeling secure. I can be like I want, I can say what I want, no one is judging me, no one's telling me to shut up. So this was one of their most important drivers to join these groups, to become part of these groups, to align with this political force. Also, of course, they had also ideas, racist ideas about immigration and so on that motivated them, but really this kind of, I can be myself, was their most important driving force. I found that quite interesting, and I think it ties quite well into this role of emotions. So I think this is a part of the answer, and another part of the answer might be that we really have a situation where a lot of discourses that have developed kind of separately have now joined forces, have now come together, coincide, let's say, in their anti-feminist and anti-gender movements. This is, we can look at the so-called manosphere, the internet sphere, which kind of, where we see a strange mix kind of internet culture, misogynist ideas, ideologies, and an aggressive masculinity that's performed there that kind of coincides with what right-wing extremist nativists, who have always kind of cared most about their ethnically defined pure nation, are proposing in terms of gender relations, which coincides with right-wing conservatives who think about the family as the basic unit of society as a whole, and who are afraid, and I think this is where it's also partly a reaction to the gains of emancipatory movement, feminist LGBTIQ movements over the last years, that they see their traditional definition of the family endangered because it's not the only livable option anymore. It's not the only possible way of life, and they want that back. They want this unquestioned normality, this unquestioned status of their way of living as being the only right thing kind of back. So I think there we have this element of a backlash, but it's not the only thing that defines this movement. So that's part of, I think that's part of the answers I would give on why it is so, why these movements are so successful at the moment, or why they can have such a power of mobilization, and why they can really dig into very different strata of the population, why people go marching that I don't think have ever been on a demonstration in their lives before, and now they come out for a cause that seems, if you just look at it kind of rationally, quite absurd. I mean, who'd go marching because language gets more inclusive? That's kind of, doesn't seem to be a big issue if you look at it rationally, but they combine it to a threat that's a total threat, that's a threat to the family, that's a threat to their children, that's a threat to society as a whole. So this kind of interlinking discourses to form one big narrative about how society is going to fall and how it's all going down is, I think, their most attractive mobilizing force behind them. And even if they can't agree on all the details probably and have come from very different parts, this is the thing they can agree on.
Estoy encantada de...
I am thrilled of listening to you. I love your perspective. And there's here Alexander, who is carrying out a PhD on gender, bodies, and political impacts. And we have had a wide debate about Mayanovic's concept on gender. She says that gender is acting on populism, extremisms, as a symbolic tale agglutinating processes, racist processes, LGBTIQ phobic, etc. So I believe that, well, I'm an anthropologist, and of course this has an impact of 1000%, but here I'm about to say it's not so much about gender, but about what gender triggers, because gender resonates on us all. We all know when you are told gender, you know what we're talking about. We all know what gender we are meant to express. We all know how the world is structured on the basis of gender, the heteropatriarchal world and the chaos of LGBTIQ, gender equality scenarios. So gender is a trigger. Gender is a trigger of a fear. We know a safe environment, even if it's an oppressive one. So when we speak about gender equality, we trigger a very powerful emotion. We can produce fear, the need for change, the need for not being judged, feeling well, having peers, having colleagues, which is very much related to masculinity, right? Developing colleagues, which are like your besties, your friendies. We're seeing that in the US all the time. There are more and more movements, and I love studying, by the way. The men going the wrong way, I love them. They are just incredible. I will share a fun anecdote. Once in Amazon, I saw a book on men going the wrong way. Very nice books with a black cover and a logo, and I thought this is like the Bible of the men going the wrong way, so I'm gonna buy it right away. I clicked and I funded them. It's just merchandising. So I just funded the men going the wrong way. They send me a notebook with no content. So they do a great deal of merchandising. They try and develop a very powerful emotional link, and they try to build solidarity amongst them. So it's quite incredible. It's quite interesting to see, or to see that you have raised this idea of gender, not from a traditional perspective, but also about what emotions gender triggers and how gender is being used politically, because it has a very, very high potential for mobilization. Unless you want to take one last round, we're going to open the Q&A session, both to those following us through streaming and those in the room.
¿Abrimos?
Shall we open for Q&A? Good.
Pues a ver. Muy bien.
Stefanos, can you help us with the microphone? Thank you.
Mira. No, él no quiere preguntar. Él iba a llevar el micro, pero si lo llevas tú... pues mira. He's taking charge of that.
Hola. Bueno, gracias.
So, hi, and thank you very much for the debate, to all of you. So let me raise a couple of items now regarding what you said about hyper-masculinization and the idea of migrants being hyper-masculinized and considered violent, and how the press join efforts to go against hyper-masculinization. But at the same time, what I'm surprised is that hyper-masculinization is used to attack hyper-masculinization. It is not said like, okay, we're gonna get rid of them peacefully, we're gonna kindly ask them to leave. No, we're gonna kill them, we're gonna chase them and kick them out. But this hyper-masculinization is legitimized through the media, right? I don't understand how is it possible that hyper-masculinization is name and shame in the case of migrants, but at the same time is totally normal and accepted when it's used to defend ourselves, right? And then I have a comment also about what you mentioned regarding why populisms are so much in demand, let's say, or why this hyper-masculinization is becoming an identity again. I believe that we're experiencing an era in which there is a climate crisis. You cannot eat meat anymore, then there's an economic crisis, you have a precarious life. So experiencing several crises, we have to build equality. And I have the feeling that many men consider that the only thing that stays alive is men identity, masculinity. Like, okay, if I lose masculinity now, I'm gonna go nuts. And that's why probably they attach so much to masculinity. It's the last resort available. Of course, at some point we're gonna be attacked on our masculinity, thankfully. And finally we'll be depressed for a while and perhaps rebuild ourselves. But I believe that many people only have masculinity left. And that's probably one reason to understand the rise of populisms and the rise of hyper-masculinization. Well, I'm not sure about what you say, but it's very interesting comment indeed. Perhaps your comment could be interpreted in the following way. Let's make a link with national identity. Masculinity has a great deal of components, right? And some components have nothing to do with gender, but rather with nation, or the difference between men and women, right? For example, the Franco troops. They were hyper-masculine, violent, very aggressive, etc. Yet their masculinity was justified through a superior ideal, whereas for them, Africans had no justification for their hyper-masculinization because they were not fighting for a respectful nation. They were violent per se, and that's it. So the interaction between these two elements contributes to developing one's own masculinity as something elevated or high, and consider other forms of hyper-masculinization as degrading. So the difference you make is quite true. And I believe that hyper-masculinization, when it affects you as an individual, is justified because we say, okay, this is because we are defending our nation, our society, we need to avoid others from, you know, stealing our jobs and wives, etc. But you are right, you're right. It's a very interesting paradox, and a very productive one, probably. So, yep, now regarding the crisis, or the idea of masculinity as the last resort available for men, there are authors that consider that these pissed off white men who've lost their job, their authority in the community, etc., they cannot get everything back. You're not gonna get back your job, your social status, your political power, etc. So deal with it, right? And this is frustrating, and according to the author, they focus on recovering virility because this depends on them. It's specific, it's tangible. You can work out to become more masculine, and you know, it's very instinctive. So yeah, I think it is related to what you were mentioning, right? As masculinity being the last resort. The symbolic blue concept is very interesting, and gender understood as a vehicle for other social phenomena. Gender, or masculinity and femininity, are in fact empty because they are changing, and sometimes they are stuffed with concepts such as the nation, white supremacy, freedom, as I said before. Sometimes it's stuffed with social concepts that are just channeled through masculinity, but nothing else.
To add to the first question on hypermasculinization, I think one aspect of it is also that it happens before a post-feminist background, or a background that is defined as post-feminists by these anti-feminist groups and people that want movements, where they say, we as a society, we have established gender equality. There's nothing left to do. Men and women are equal here. Of course, for a very, very limited version of equality, they are mainly talking about equality of rights, not about social equality or anything like that. So before this background, it's about we defend this equality, and I think they don't really make this link to that aggressive masculinities or hypermasculinization is in itself the problem. It's only the aggression of the others that's deemed problematic. And I think this rather widespread post-feminist feeling or thinking, it's mostly not spelled out like that, is an important background here that helps to legitimize their own aggression and their own version of aggressive masculinity. And yeah, maybe just a small footnote to what you said on crisis. I completely agree with that. In a project a colleague of mine did, they asked people in the workplace about how they see their political and how they see their political agency, both in the workplace and in larger society. And the results were actually rather depressing, because most people said, well, none. I can't defend myself in the workplace. I have to take whatever they offer, and there's no way I can influence politics. More or less, this was the baseline of what most people said. But the one sphere in their life where they felt they still had power, they still had the ability to shape things, was what can be a little bit sloppily called the private sphere, so private relations, including gender relations, family relations. So this might be kind of, the empirical footnote to what you just spelled out on the conceptual level.
Yo, si me permitís, también querría añadir algo.
So if you allow me, I would like to add something. Masculinity is like theater. It's in a permanent crisis. It's been undergoing a crisis forever. We've been speaking about the crisis of masculinity for ages. Now, in a context of global crisis, many people focus on safe values, not just gender. Especially if you belong to a powerful gender like the masculine gender. But I would say yes, but not only. We cannot keep thinking on an action-reaction scheme. Things have been changing things are not happening this way for a long time. We have a general crisis, yeah, of course, but why these are not the other? Why this reaction and not another? This has always been the case, right? This is the modus operandi of how we have developed our own lives and our societies. So I really like, when I teach about the topic, I always use the metaphor of tectonic plates. We are living on tectonic plates with heterogeneous meanings regarding gender and other items, and they are coexisting. And all of a sudden there's a clash, a volcano eruption, all of a sudden there's a trigger, and the tectonic plate opens wide, and there's something that pops up, this thing was already there. This misogyny that I was referring to yesterday. Yesterday I referred to an author, Haddock, I believe, and he argued that this misogyny is nothing new, it has always existed. So, of course, when I read something that I agree on, I'm very happy, but hey, these are cultural values that are deeply attached. And an example on how deeply attached or grounded they are is precisely the immense work that many men are doing to stop being the way they have been told to be, or the intense personal work that many women have had to do to become who we are and stop being who we were told to be. So the fact that it's so hard to change your gender expression means that we're still there. Of course, perhaps a general global crisis context has an impact in terms of going back to traditional values, the values of the traditional family, the going back into what I can manage, but I believe other things are happening. And, well, other processes are operating. Do we have online questions? We need to follow the online questions. So I have a question. There's been a survey on youth, and 20% of youth consider that gender violence does not exist, when in fact there's been an increase. And it goes hand in hand with extreme right-wing movements, race. This is quite contradictory in a society which is more and more egalitarian, in theory, right? Because in real terms, perhaps it's a little bit more complicated. And I believe society is failing because many young, well, 20% of the youth consider that gender violence does not even exist. And I believe this is quite frustrating. What can we do? For example, those who are teachers or those who work with youth. Oh, I don't know, it's very frustrating and complicated. Then I would like to ask you the following. The relationship between traditional masculinity and nation. Could we perhaps find examples of other models, to put it this way, other masculinity models that somehow, well, I'm thinking about the pro-independence movement, for example, of other nation projects that are based on liberation from a central state. Have you reflected on this point? In these more alternative national projects, is there a rupture regarding the traditional masculine model?
Well, I have to admit this is not one of my main topics, but what came to mind is especially the way of governing that, for example, the Zapatistas proposed. This very basic democracy mixing in traditional elements with really new ideas, with older left-wing ideas. So I think this way of rethinking democracy as a bottom-up process might hold some keys, some answers to that question. But to tell you the truth, I'm not that positive. I'm not that optimistic about really new ideas, new models coming up. So that's kind of the well. Maybe also in the Kurdish movement we see some new things tried out that I believe are quite interesting, even if they very much rely on gender as a how do you say bifurcated concept. So men here, women here. So there's really quite a lot of issues to be raised there. But I think these would be the two examples that come to my mind when I'd look for alternatives. But I really have to admit that's not my area of expertise.
Sobre lo del 20%, no lo sé.
Now regarding the 20% you mentioned, I have no clue, to be honest. Now we are in a therapy session. I had this experience with my master's students. They told me that in their high schools there's an increase in the percentage of young men that consider themselves happily to be macho and to be pro-machism. openly. When I was young, a long time ago, it was unthinkable. When I attended high school, no one would have declared this machism happily, with a smile on their face. Quite incredible. I guess it's a way to gain security on oneself. It's an affirmation of one's identity in a period of crisis. So if vulnerability is not considered masculinity, of course, I want to be a macho, right? I know this is a very psychological approach. Probably that they are pissed off with life, and that's why they reclaim this machism. Now, regarding nations, I am not sure. I can't really see any groundbreaking innovation in terms of new national identities being based on subversive gender definitions. Do you have any example? Now regarding the 20%, I believe it's worrisome, very much worrisome. I believe this is not a failure. Today was 20, before it was 10. It has never disappeared. We have not been successful in developing a fair and even society. It just things are worsening. Regarding the other item that you raised in the presentation to this session, I briefly mentioned that feminism and nationalism are a national construction process that are considered to be antagonic. And they are oftentimes considered to be antagonical because there is an apparatus, an implicit apparatus in the way national struggles are developed that are highly masculine, and there is a very important resistance to accepting other forms. There are many cases in literature, at least, of attempts to build alternative national projects and feminist projects like the one proposed by the left wing in Catalonia, or so in the Basque country. The Scottish National Party declares itself as feminist, but let me assure you that they tweet nothing with gender content. The Abertzales and the Catalans do. They tweet, at least. The only areas, careful, because I'm not saying that women do not take part in national struggles, and I'm not saying that national struggles cannot be feminist. No, what I say here is what happens when we can finally build a new nation, when the problem oftentimes is that national demands always go first or before gender, and the only geographical areas where this seems not to be the case is in Rojava in Syria, and in Kurdistan. But I haven't been there.
May I just one thing to your example about the 20%, because you mentioned young men, and I just thought of something that a social worker told me just last year, that one of the really difficult things in her job is when young women tell her, yeah, well, if this boy loves me, then he has to hit me when I do something wrong. It's the thing to do. And yeah, this kind of thinking has not gone away. It's still here.
Miro a traducción. Tenemos 5 minutos. Last question. Nelly, go ahead.
I think I want to touch on something that you were kind of passing by now, and that I think hasn't been discussed yet. I was wondering about, like, in a lot of European right-wing movements, we have these female poster girls that are very important. Like, we have Alice Weidel in Germany, and we also have Marine Le Pen. And I was wondering why are, like, in your opinion, why are they so important and also have these maybe outstanding roles in these movements that we can definitely analyze as something very manly and has this a lot of masculine characteristics?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that's of course heavily debated. Maybe taking Alice Weidel, because she's the most outstanding example, I think. She's openly lesbian, living with another woman, having a child together, raising the child together. So she's really does not fit well within our model of how gender relations are thought within right-wing extremist or right-wing populist parties. And I don't really have an answer to how she got into this position and why she's kind of allowed to keep it, why she's allowed to be that important. One thing which might be at least part of the answer is that especially right-wing extremist parties do not care so much about family relations and about what they deem private relations. They also don't care so much about homosexuality, for example, as long as it's not visible within the public sphere, as long as it is not about equal rights or equal social status, stuff like this. So maybe that's part of the answer why she seems acceptable to the party, even without fitting into this gender model that they kind of built around, that their ideology is kind of built around. And from my take on her, it's also quite interesting that she rarely speaks about anything touching upon gender politics. That's not her field, that's not what she talks about in public most of the time. So maybe this kind of division of work is something that's at play here. You mentioned poster girls. As I said, I'm not sure this fits to Alice Weidel. It might fit better to Le Pen, or also to some past experiences we've had in Austria, where the female leader is more of a front than the one with the real power. I'm not quite sure about Le Pen in this context. There are some other examples of this. But it's one of the ambivalences when we come to talking about actors and their gender expressions and gender roles they take up, that they quite often do not fit into the party line in terms of ideology. We also see this on the level of activists, where we have parties with a very traditional gender roles inscribed in their ideology, and still we have women that are very politically active and are very activists for a party and speak in public and all that. So we see the ambivalence there. In many cases, they are deemed the exception. So in many cases, this ambivalence is kind of negotiated by calling them the exception, because for whatever reason they cannot be the mother, the one caring for the family as ideology would prescribe. So being an activist for a party that wants to foster that is kind of the next best thing to do. I know this answer is not quite perfect yet. I've been debating that on a lot of conferences on right-wing extremism, right-wing populism recently. And to my knowledge, all our hypotheses until now are kind of in this, it's an ambivalence, and it seems to be a way of kind of negotiating this ambivalence.
Gemma, no sé si vols afegir alguna cosa.
Would you like to add anything else?
Bueno, yo diría que esta paradoja
I would say that this paradox has to do with the fact that masculine values that structure our society are shared by many women, because of course we're speaking about collective social values. And if women, well, women are part of society, right? We all agree on that. We're speaking about collective values accepted by us all. So it does not affect only men. You made me think about the classic example of this paradox in Spain, Pilar Primo de Rivera, who was the leader of the feminine fascist group, and at the same time that she promoted the family ideal, mothers being at home, she was a political leader with a lot of political power, she was single, etc. So her ambivalence has been the basis of so many PhD projects. There's no clear answer yet. I believe that these traditionally masculine values are not only exerted by men, they are shared also by women. So I believe we can now close this morning's dialogue. It's been very rich and interesting. My expectations were high, I must say. Thanks, Gemma. Thanks, Stephanie. Thanks to all of you here in the room and following us through streaming.
Bueno, bienvenidas a todas a esta segunda parte de la mañana del Many Movement. Como ya habréis visto en el horario, tenemos el placer de contar con los doctores Paul Poulet y Martin Hullman y su libro Ecomasculinidades, la doctora Anastasia Tellez, que nos presentará tanto el libro como De la teoría a la acción en busca de las masculinidades igualitarias, y también el Observatorio de las Masculinidades, y con el doctor Custodio Delgado y el libro Men Activists to End Violence Against Women, Voices from Spain, Sweden and UK. Empezaré presentando a los primeros, a Paul Poulet y a Martin Hullman. El doctor Paul Poulet, he's an Australian social and environmental justice activist, ecopreneur, and scholar. His research ponders the intersections between men, masculinities, and earth through the lenses of critical studies on men and masculinities, environmental philosophy, and feminist care theory, resulting basically in 2 books, a monograph titled Ecological Masculinities, Theoretical Foundations and Practical Guidance, followed by an anthology called Men, Masculinities and Earth, contending with the Anthropocene, and with a 3rd book and accompanying a documentary underway that is intended to reach popular culture and focuses on the masculinist aspects of our growing social and ecological crisis. He's also working in eco-queering ecological masculinities in a move towards non-binary explorations. Paul's work is published in and influences numerous academic texts and popular science articles on ecological masculinities within gender and environmental meta-narrative, along with the government, corporate, NGOs, intersectional and climate activist applications. His specialization addresses the social constructions of masculinities that dwell in everyone, with particular interest in supporting a post-gender, social just, and ecological sustainable future for all of life. Dr. Martin Hullman asks questions such as, why don't we act when we have known the existential danger of climate change for over 30 years? These are the questions that Professor Martin Hullman dealt with in his research, praxis, and everyday lives. And Hullman is widely published in energy and climate issues. Especially notable are the articles "The Making of an Environmental Hero, A History of Eco-Modern Masculinity," Full Thales and Arnold Schwarzenegger, and "A Green Fatwa, Climate Change as a Threat to Masculinity of Industrial Modernity." And then also his books, Discourse of Global Climate Change, Ecological Masculinities and Men, Masculinities and Earth, Contending with the Anthropocene. And as part of his academic work, he published chronicles in a wide range of newspapers, gave lectures on contemporary politics, and advised NGOs as well as governmental agencies. Dr. Hullman leads 3 research groups analyzing gender and energy, ecopreneurship in circular economies, and climate change denial at Chelmsford University of Technology. He is currently writing on a book with the preliminary title Co-Created Earth Peace, The Path of Ecopedagogy, Ecological Masculinities and Rights of Nature. So Martin Hullman and Paul Poulet, the floor is yours.
Thank you. That was a long introduction, and I can understand that you got a bit of a sore throat out of that. So thank you very much for that introduction. And thank you very much for organizing this. I'm very happy that me and Paul are invited to talk a bit about our 2 books here today. So we will have a bit of a dialogue and conversation among us, me and Paul. And I will start a bit by saying a few words on our first collaboration on our first book together, Ecological Masculinities. And we met maybe by serendipity, maybe by chance, but probably it was meant to be so in Munich at the conference regarding masculinities and environment and gender issues and ecofeminism a few years ago. And we came together there from our different paths of research and praxis regarding masculinities and environment and climate and energy issues. And we instantly decided us to first write a monograph together, bringing together our knowledges and experiences in this field, because we recognized that even though there had been quite a lot of research founding this field and asking also for more research, that research had not been compounded into a monograph. So we would wanted to offer the world that. So that was our first book, Ecological Masculinities. And then we also came to the conclusion that we wanted to invite also all the other scholars there and others doing work here. And that is the anthology that Paul is going to present more about later on. But then ecological masculinities, what does that contain? Yeah, we bring together 4 streams of research that we think can highlight and that has been before us, so to speak. So we bring together the knowledge from masculinity studies, ecological feminists of various kinds, care theory, and then as well as coming together as the 4th stream is what we say that comes from the deep ecology and the RNS tradition. And these 3 academic traditions that we envision as streams, they bring with them important concepts, ontological perspectives, and analysis that we think is needed to build a new shelter on a shore of this stream that comes together, that brings together this type of academic material, in which we can then talk and explore and discuss and develop ideas of ecological masculinities. So that can show you the image and what we have been thinking about when we brought together this book. And we have thought that these 4 streams, they bring together important parts, so to speak. The masculinity studies explain that masculinities are always in plural, they are material, and they are also constructed. They can change, and they can also be understood as hegemonic in different types of our relationships. The deep ecology brings with us the notion that we are part of nature all the time. We are in relationship with nature, and we need to understand that. The ecofeminism, of course, bring the gender aspects into this, and also the power aspects and understandings of how this has been brought about structurally. And then we have the care theory, which we think could be a way to at least understand how we can extend and expand our ways of thinking about ourselves in together with nature, and also what we need to be engaged with, care for the whole planet, so to speak. And that is kind of the background for the book and the 4 streams, the 4 research traditions that we bring about. And then I leave the floor to Paul to say a few words on kind of what do we do with that, and where do we bring it in this book?
better unmute myself. Yes, echoing Martin here, it's a delight to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to join you. And it's been such a delight, an incredible journey, actually, over the last 5 years now. A lot of relationships have been built, and the work has gone out internationally where, and we'll talk about this more in a moment, about how different people from different disciplines are taking their own expertise into the work and bringing the work into their own fields of expertise to help expand and enrich the processes that we talk about, both conceptually and practically. But I guess I just wanted to say a couple of things to support Martin's statements here, which is that this idea of a shelter on the shore of a stream or an estuary comes originally, it was something that came to me when I was teaching Australian ecology and environmental issues. And one of the things that I did was that I did a transect with my students through a watershed, and we crossed 4 individual rivers actually that emptied into one estuary. One of the things that I noticed with those students was how these streams or rivers actually carry many different parts that all get mixed up and blended together and then throw things up on the shore in the estuary to create something new. It's a very organic ecological process that's both aquatic as well as terrestrial. And one of the things that came to us when we were talking about this was Martin and I had this lovely conversation about, well, how about building something with those parts, which is, of course, you know, quite a masculine, traditionally masculine kind of approach, which is to build something from these very organic and flowing kind of component parts. And so it ended up being the metaphor ended up being this incredible blend of what traditionally gets feminized and what traditionally gets masculinized. And then we were able to be critical about both of those categorizations in using that analogy in the monograph. And I think that was quite an exciting conversation that we had that really sort of galvanized the book and came together at the back end for those of you that get a chance to read it. So that was a really lovely piece. And I guess the other piece about the monograph is really also recognizing that, as Martin said, that a lot of different people have been sort of nibbling away at this notion of masculine, hey, what's happening with masculinities and the environment, or men and the environment, and realizing just how troubled that space is. Not only that there've been different people sort of nibbling away at it, but also that that there's been you know, a number of different approaches that have attempted to put different disciplinary monikers on a conversation about masculinities in the earth, and in some cases actually collapsing masculinities and man together. And it's been really important, I think, for us to separate out that conversation and make sure that we can be as clear as possible about when we're talking about cis male experiences with the environment versus masculinities as social constructions and those impacts and engagements with the environment. And so it's been, that's been part of the role of the monograph, is to actually start to parse those kind of complications that often get collapsed by people who aren't looking at those kind of nuances. So I might just pause there and see, Martin, I think we still have a couple of minutes actually, so yes. You started a little early, so you want to say a little bit more?
Okay, on the monograph, yes, okay. Yes. I can show up, because in the end of the monograph, we are proposing what we call masculine ecologicalization. So we have a model in the monograph called Adam N, which is a process that might be developed and also used, but this is a way in which you could think about an educational process or a transformative process, going from what we call industrial breadwinner masculinities or eco-modern masculinities towards ecological masculinities. We have developed this together with a feminist men organization in Sweden, and we have piloted it, so we have an education around that. You might say something about that, Paul, before we go to the...
Yeah, lovely. So the ADAM is an acronym, and it stands for developing awareness about gender inequity and the impact of gendered systemic and individual engagements with the environment, on the environment, but also on society. So developing an awareness about those aspects. So that's the A. Deconstructing is the D, deconstructing those engagements. Critical of those engagements, so that there's an understanding of the ways that those engagements are often destructive, but not always. And what are the possibilities for the more caring aspects of those engagements that are gendered to come forward, to bring them forward more. To make amendment when hurts are made, and that was actually influenced by studies that we did eco-psychologically around the 12-step program, because we very much see the industrial growth society as an addictive kind of relationship between humanity and the earth. It's very much it's operating very much like an addict does. And then also that we need to modify those behaviors, which is the M. And then from that awareness, deconstruction, amendment, and modification, we open up to the lowercase m, which is a new form of masculinities, which is more caring. And it's not necessarily actually new, in fact. And there are aspects of this model that we would maybe change now as the work is developed. And it's not necessarily new in the sense that it's actually in some ways quite ancient and indigenous. And I use indigenous broadly because we're all indigenous to somewhere at some point if we go back far enough in our lineages. So the ADAM model has that role to play in bringing the theoretical concepts of the monograph into practice in people's lives, very much like ecosophy T does for deep ecology, for those of you that are familiar with deep ecology.
Okay, great. Let's go over then to our anthology. Men, Masculinities and Earth, contending with the Manthropocene. It was also born out of our meeting in Munich a few years ago. And it brings together 78 chapters and contributions from 24 different scholars. Among them, Raven Connell, Richard Twine, Shirley MacGregor, and Greta Gard, and Bob Peace and Mona Hawke, for example. And the aim for this anthology, and I think we have managed with that, don't you think, Paul, was to actually take this conversation even further. So, as we said, there has been some work done, of course, and we recognize that. We do honoring that type of work in this anthology, as we did in our monograph as well. But we really wanted to, okay, so where do we actually bring this that can now maybe be thought of as a field, masculinities and environment in some way? How can we actually include those who have been working with it and those who are going to work with it? So we have both very senior professors, and we have also those great number of younger scholars that are coming with us on this journey. So that was my bit shorter part on this anthology. So Paul, please do the longer part on this one.
Yeah, so the anthology has been quite a journey also. I mean, both books have been quite a journey for me personally, but also for our relationship with each other, and then also the work. And as you can imagine, it's been intensely personal for me. I hazard to guess that it's also been intensely personal for you, Martin, as well. I won't speak for you, but the intensely personal part of it is that a lot of what brought me to this work originally was actually my relationship with my father. And that's often the kind of entry into questions about masculinity that I hear many men reporting as the reason that they get into asking deeper questions. And on the other end of that, with women and then with marginalized non-binary people, the impact of those particular patterns on people's lives broadly, particularly from a masculine or male-dominated world. So there's been a lot of conversations on a personal level, often at parties or, you know, with family or friends, as much as the deep scholarship that we've both done, to try to unpack what is it that's actually happening for the environment that's being influenced by traditional forms of masculinities. And then with the second book, what we wanted to do was ask that kind of question to people who have expertise in many different fields beyond our own. And a lot of the motivation there was to find a way to give the work away, so to speak, to make sure that we're not holding it, because in a sense, if we held it in that more traditional academic way, we would then be doing exactly what it is that we're actually saying in the books we want to undo. And so the idea behind the anthology was very much to turn the conversation over to a community of practice. And in the process of having that community of practice look at this first book, the monograph, this concept, this field of study, as Martin refers to it, how do people with their different areas of expertise that respond to the work, what do they want to do with that work, and how might they take it forward, or how might they suggest it be taken forward? And so with those questions, a lot of what came out at the back end of the book, and Martin held it up, you know, with those 27 contributors from these different disciplines: anthropology, gender studies, history, ethology, sociology, food politics. There's a lot of people coming from a lot of different and quite disparate, or eco-criticism, coming from a lot of disparate perspectives that have basically said that the fundamental thing that needs to happen with this conversation is that it doesn't get locked or sucked into an essentialized way of seeing the world. And essentialism, for those of you that aren't familiar with it, is saying that men are essentially like this and women are essentially like that, and we ignore non-binary people because they don't exist, you know, which is obviously a very oppressive and very unjust way of seeing the world, to lock men into a certain way of being and women into a certain way of being, and then ignoring the non-binary, and I think is profoundly problematic, of course. And so the book really, at the back end of it, gave us an opportunity to see that in the process of having a conversation about the ecologization of masculinities, we also need to be having a conversation about how that conversation contributes to a bigger conversation about the human relationship with the planet. And that there's an opportunity, I think, for it to be a piece in a puzzle, but not a panacea, not a silver bullet, to use the masculinist term. So the idea behind the second book has been to expose the different ways that we can use ecological masculinities, this process of masculine ecologization, in a critical way that also is much more flexible than the term itself would ordinarily imply. In other words, we're not just looking at masculinities. I mean, the plural obviously diversifies it to some degree, masculinities, which we get from Raymond Connell's work, but also then that we're not stuck in the men's studies camp, but actually looking at the human relationship with ourselves, with each other, and with the planet on the broader scale, and how can we bring care forward throughout those three different scales of relationality. So that's a lot of what the second book, the anthology, is about. Is looking at that looking at that kind of outcome from different perspectives. And what we did was we divided it into different sections according to those different disciplines, because people generally came from I think it was 4 different sections in the end. And that's my time. Back to you, Martin.
Thank you very much. I don't know how we are doing on the total time.
A couple of minutes.
I think we are kind of at the end of our time on the stage now. So I just want to conclude with that it has been such an illuminating, very rewarding and very exciting process so far with these type of questions. And I'm happy also to be both personal and political in doing this work with you, Paul, and with all the contributors and all the people that have been before us and motivated us and been very influential on our work. So I'm looking forward to maybe some questions or comments or some dialogue on this. Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, both of them. Thank you for these amazing books, and I think they try to make some questions about like very specific ways, and I think it can link very well with Jeff Hearn conversation yesterday when he motivated us to not to see the men's studies as an endogenous studies, but asking from that space questions about the human relations in a complete sense. Pasamos ahora ya a presentar a la doctora Anastasia Tellez Infante. Es doctora en antropología y profesora titular de antropología social de la Universidad Miguel Hernández de Elche. Es directora del Observatorio de Masculinidades, el cual nos presentará hoy, y del título de especialista en masculinidades, género e igualdad. Es coordinadora en la Universidad Miguel Hernández del máster universitario en igualdad, género y género en el ámbito público y privado, y presidenta del primer Congreso Internacional sobre Masculinidades e Igualdad en busca de buenas prácticas de masculinidades igualitarias desde el ámbito de la Universidad Cima Igual. Entre sus últimas publicaciones sobre masculinidades podemos destacar De la teoría a la acción en busca de masculinidades igualitarias, el cual también nos presentará hoy, Hombres, género y patriarcado, reflexiones, cuerpos y representaciones, del 2020, Masculinidades igualitarias y alternativas, procesos, avances y reacciones, del 2019, también en el 2019, Destruyendo la masculinidad, cultura, género e identidad, y en el 2017, Igualdad de género e identidad masculina. El tiempo es tuyo, Anastasia. Muchísimas gracias por estar aquí.
Hola. Bueno, pues en primer lugar, un placer. Thank you very much. I am so glad to be here, but I'm going to talk in Spanish. Sorry. Encantada. Voy a aprovechar el tiempo y lo que sí, Alexander, si ves que me alargo, voy a intentar controlarlo, ¿vale? No agotarlo.
Yo te aviso, de todas formas.
Vale, muchísimas gracias. Bueno, pues en primer lugar era comentaros la idea, si queréis poner de fondo el Observatorio de las Masculinidades, o si no, luego podéis pasar el link y no tiene mayor complicación. Os cuento. En la universidad en la que trabajo, en la que estoy, en la Universidad Miguel Hernández de Elche, hacía ya tiempo que queríamos darle forma al tema de abordar desde un punto de vista feminista el estudio de hombres. Entonces, en mi trayectoria personal, que llevo pues eso, como 3 décadas trabajando la igualdad de género desde la antropología social y cultural, era inevitable hablar de relaciones de género y no podíamos estudiar mujeres sin tener en cuenta la construcción cultural de la feminidad y, por lo tanto, la construcción cultural de la masculinidad. Cómo cada cultura en un momento histórico determinado construye lo que es propio de hombres, las masculinidades hegemónicas, y cómo en los últimos años tenemos diferentes formas de ser hombres en nuestro propio país, en nuestro propio contexto cultural. A partir de ahí hicimos aquel congreso que has referido, Alexander, el CIMAST Igual, que está colgado para quien tenga interés, el Congreso Masculinidades, Género e Igualdad, y lo primero que queríamos, a diferencia de congresos anteriores que se han hecho y que conoceréis, aquí en el Estado español lo que queríamos era ver qué se hacía desde la universidad, para precisamente poner sobre la mesa lo poco que se estaba haciendo a nivel académico, a nivel científico, incluso desde el feminismo académico, en torno a los hombres y la igualdad de género. Aquel fue aquel congreso del 2019, de abril 2019, que está todo colgado, todas las ponencias, conferencias, y bueno, las conclusiones eran esas, resumidamente. Los másteres de igualdad y género que se están dando desde hace ya 15 años, que coordino uno con la Universidad Jaume I de Castellón. En todos los másteres de igualdad y género en las universidades españolas, en los posgrados, cursos de especialista, etcétera, que abordan el tema de la igualdad de género, en los programas de doctorado buenísimos que tenemos en este país, el tema de las masculinidades apenas se tocaba, apenas se abordaba. Eso era el objetivo básico de poner en el Congreso de Más que Igual encima de la mesa. Es más, en las unidades de igualdad de las universidades españolas apenas se contemplan los planes de igualdad de las propias universidades enfocadas a alumnado, profesorado, etcétera, PAS, el tema de los hombres. Bueno, una vez dicho eso, de aquel congreso sacamos dos objetivos. Uno era crear lo que hemos creado en enero de este año 2021, y es darle forma dentro del grupo de investigación que dirijo al Observatorio de las Masculinidades. Este observatorio está anclado en una universidad pública, en la Miguel Hernández, pero está abierto a todo aquel y toda aquella que quiera colaborar, a otras universidades, a otros países, a otros especialistas, etc. De hecho, ahí en el propio, si veis básicamente en la presentación, tenéis los 4 objetivos que tiene este observatorio y que desde aquí a toda la audiencia, a toda aquella persona que escuche esta charla y que quiera sumarse, ahí tenéis la lista de suscripción, porque la idea es que esto sea una herramienta de servicio académico, científico, pero que vincule lo que es el activismo de hombres proigualitarios con la investigación científica y, por supuesto, con el enfoque profesional, con trabajadores sociales, con maestros, maestras coeducando, ayuntamientos elaborando planes de igualdad local, etc. Entonces, bueno, la pretensión está anclado, como os digo, desde el punto de vista científico en la universidad, pero está al servicio de activismo y al servicio de administraciones, ONG, organizaciones, empresas, etc. A partir de ahí, el observatorio, que desde aquí estáis todas invitadas, tiene un apartado de recursos que vamos alimentando, donde colgamos y tenemos que actualizarlo ahora cuando empiece otra vez noviembre, artículos que traten el tema de las masculinidades, libros, tesis doctorales, etc. Con lo cual os invitamos desde ya a que libros y publicaciones e investigaciones que tengáis nos las hacéis llegar por email al observatorio y nosotros encantados ahí las colgamos y las presentamos. Con esta idea de servicio, de ir construyendo, trabajamos muchísimo en redes. Las redes que hemos empezado desde enero hasta ahora son básicamente en Latinoamérica, ¿vale? Y aquí, en el Estado español. ¿Por qué? Porque hemos acudido a lo más básico, que era pues, el idioma. Y estas redes las vamos a ir ampliando ya, obviamente, pues, a otros países anglófonos, etcétera, Italia, Francia, Portugal, que también las tenemos ya establecidas. Otro objetivo dentro del observatorio, este primer año de andadura, ha sido el poner en valor lo que aquí estamos haciendo, que es presentar libros sobre masculinidades, libros recientes con enfoques teóricos o enfoques empíricos o enfoques aplicados de intervención. Y en ese sentido, en el observatorio, en el blog, tenéis el primer ciclo de seminarios conversatorios sobre 14 libros que hemos presentado desde enero hasta julio. Ahí tenéis, si tenéis interés, el autor o autora o quien coordina el monográfico presenta los contenidos básicos de ese libro sobre masculinidades y luego se hace un debate muy en la línea de lo que estamos aquí haciendo. Entonces ahí tenéis una herramienta por si en algún momento os parece interesante. Y vamos a empezar el segundo ciclo de presentación de libros y conversatorios, con lo cual contamos con el equipo que estáis aquí, por supuesto, como siempre. Una vez dicho eso, me invitabais a que me centrara en los libros que ha presentado Alexander. Es simplemente deciros, lo tenéis todo colgado, por eso no me voy a extender para no quitaros tiempo, pero tenéis en el Observatorio de las Masculinidades los conversatorios y los libros que yo aquí brevemente os voy a referir y en el que me voy a detener. Esto también surgió como un compromiso del Congreso Igual del 2019. En primer lugar era, pues eso, ¿no? Era un libro de masculinidades igualitarias y alternativas, procesos, avances y reacciones. Y nuestra intención era, y es, investigaciones que se estén llevando a cabo, darlas a conocer. Cierto que ya se viene haciendo y quienes trabajamos el tema de las masculinidades y la igualdad de género sabemos que cada vez hay más producción, pero hacía falta como aunar desde nuestro punto de vista lo más actualmente posible lo que se estaba haciendo a los dos lados, ¿no? España y Latinoamérica. Ahí pusimos sobre la mesa, tenéis un abanico enorme, intervienen muchísimos expertos y expertas de muchas universidades, instituciones, países, con temática muy diversa que seleccionamos, y ese viene a complementar otro que también publicamos el mismo año, 2019, con la editorial Tirán Humanidades, Tirán Leblanc. El otro tiene por título Deconstruyendo las masculinidades, o la masculinidad, cultura, género e identidad. Y vamos volviendo a retomar el concepto identidad, el concepto género tan polémico en los últimos años. Después de hacer estos dos libros con aproximaciones principalmente teóricas y de diversos puntos de vista, disciplinas, países, queríamos ir aterrizando en la importancia que le dábamos y el sello de identidad que tenemos. Desde el observatorio y nuestro grupo de investigación, el acercamiento al estudio de hombres, de las masculinidades, la construcción cultural de la masculinidad, las nuevas formas de masculinidades proigualitarias, siempre parten de toda la teoría, el bagaje y la epistemología del feminismo, de los estudios de género feministas. Desde ahí el posicionamiento, con lo cual queríamos un libro, que es el del 2020, que tuviese como objetivo hombres, género y patriarcado, reflexiones, cuerpos y representaciones. Bueno, pues igualmente otra batería de capítulos, de investigaciones, de teoría, de grupos de investigación de diferentes universidades con diferentes enfoques. Y ya, así en la producción esta de trabajar, porque es un placer, como bien sabéis, ¿no? Trabajar en redes, aquí lo venís haciendo ya en estos últimos 5 años y bueno, espero que dure muchísimo más. Esto de trabajar en redes tiene una parte mala, negativa, que es que nos picamos, ¿no? Nos alentamos unos a otros, unas a otras, entonces con lo que no se te ocurre a ti o se te ocurre pero no quieres hacer, ya te invitan, ya una publicación, un artículo, una conferencia, un webinar, una charla. La verdad es que estamos siendo muy prolíficos. El grupo, pero el grupo que sois todos y todas, que no es algo que quiero que personalicéis ni en mí, ni en mi grupo, ni en mi universidad. Nosotros estamos tirando de un carro, pero un carro que somos colaboradores, creo que hay 100 y pico, y esto trae muchísima más gente, ¿no? Detrás. Lo digo porque después de estos libros y otros que no nombro aquí, sobre reflexiones teóricas que hemos coordinado Joan Sanfélix Albelda, compañero profesor sociólogo de la Universidad de Castellón y de Valencia, Javier Eloy Martínez Grau, compañero antropólogo de la Universidad de Murcia, y yo, Anastasia Tellez, antropóloga de la Universidad de Elche, somos los tres que hemos ido coordinando todos estos libros, insisto, plurales, colectivos. Y necesitábamos un cuarto, que hemos publicado en el 2021, que fuese de la teoría a la acción, a la práctica, a la aplicabilidad de todo este conocimiento, conceptos, reflexiones, etc. Entonces, bueno, este es el libro último, el que se me invitaba aquí a explicaros un pelín más, de la teoría a la acción en busca de masculinidades igualitarias, directamente. Donde debatimos, bueno, pues, presentamos, hemos invitado, tenemos el placer de tener pues igualmente experiencias prácticas de intervención social con hombres desde la perspectiva de género, con enfoque feminista en búsqueda de la igualdad de género entre mujeres y hombres, hombres y mujeres, pero ver también cómo se han ido, por un lado, desarrollando las políticas públicas, cómo se ha tratado y cómo se deberán tratar en las políticas públicas incorporar a los hombres al tema de la igualdad. ¿Qué se está haciendo desde a nivel europeo, internacional, a nivel estatal, a nivel autonómico y a nivel local, ¿no? Desde los planes municipales de ayuntamientos a todo lo demás que os acabo de decir, cómo introducir el tema de la igualdad y la masculinidad. Cómo educar de otra manera, cómo socializar de manera, pues en el sentido de masculinidades despatriarcalizadas, no machistas, no androcéntricas, cómo apostar por esta enorme diversidad desde un punto de vista interseccional de las múltiples formas de ser hombres, cómo está, esperamos y creemos y estamos en ello, ¿no? desmembrándose o descomponiéndose la masculinidad tradicional hegemónica, patriarcal, que siempre hemos conocido, y cómo van saliendo otras formas de, iba a decir, de incorporar, ¿no?, en el cuerpo y en las prácticas, en los discursos, ser hombres profeministas, se puede ser proigualitarios, despatriarcalizados, disidentes, masculinidades contrahegemónicas, porque el concepto que estamos ya desde tiempo denunciando, ¿no?, de nuevas masculinidades, no quiere decir que sean masculinidades proigualitarias, profeministas. Puede ser una masculinidad diferente, disidente, pero neomachista, antifeminista. Entonces, bueno, todo esto lo hemos traído en este último libro, como os decía, y os digo simplemente y brevemente. A ver, pues tenemos, por ejemplo, un capítulo con los compañeros, con Baquea Alonso Fernández, Edurne Aranguren del País Vasco, Baquea de la Complutense y del CEPAIN, y Richard Bacete, trabajo con hombres y enfoque de género en proyectos sociales. Creo que es un capítulo muy didáctico, sintético y muy exhaustivo, que puede darnos muchas pistas de cómo enfocar el trabajo y la intervención con perspectiva de género en proyectos sociales, de educación social, de trabajo social, de antropología, etc. Decir a colación que me ha presentado antes el compañero Alexander, efectivamente empezamos la semana que viene el segundo posgrado de curso de especialista universitario en masculinidades, género e igualdad en la Universidad Miguel Hernández, online, y es nuestra segunda edición. Empezamos ya de manera pionera el año pasado. Bueno, pues también decir que estamos encantadas de que este año se ha puesto en marcha un posgrado de curso de especialista en masculinidades en la Universidad Complutense y en la Universidad del País Vasco, y un máster de estudio propio en la Universidad de Castilla-La Mancha. Supongo que de esto habréis hablado en diferentes contextos, pero era deciros cómo hay una demanda y cómo estamos dando una oferta de estudios de posgrado en masculinidades, género e igualdad. Bueno, pues el capítulo 3 del libro que os estoy presentando, de la teoría de la acción en busca de masculinidades igualitaria, con la editorial, que no lo he dicho antes, Dickinson, en esta ocasión, el capítulo 3 invitamos a José Ángel Lozoya y a Joaquín Montaner para que nos contaran en un capítulo exquisito la puesta en marcha del primer programa institucional para promover el cambio de los hombres hacia la igualdad, desde 1999 con José Ángel Lozoya en el Ayuntamiento de Jerez de la Frontera hasta el 2005. ¿Cómo se fraguó este proyecto pionero de trabajar en un ayuntamiento en la provincia de Cádiz, en el sur, en Andalucía, en el sur de España? ¿Cómo se propuso? ¿Qué se hizo? Porque ese rodaje ha sido imprescindible, sigue siendo modelo para quienes desde el ámbito de lo local y de los ayuntamientos quieran poner en marcha proyectos y programas enfocados en hombres, con perspectiva de género. El capítulo 4, denso y amplio, que tuve el placer de escribir con mi compañero, con Jorge Cascale, profesor de la Universidad de Valencia, abarca muchos temas que os invito a que, si tenéis oportunidad, le echéis un vistazo también. Masculinidades y activismo en el movimiento de hombres, igualdad, mitopoética y neomachismo. A ver, queríamos mapear, poner un poco un orden de cuáles son los grupos de hombres que de una manera u otra están interesados en el concepto masculinidad desde diferentes puntos de vista. Desde los más neomachistas, reaccionarios, de ideologías más de extrema derecha, en contra del avance en igualdad de las mujeres, hasta el abanico, ¿no?, pasar al otro punto de hombres igualitarios, hombres profeministas, etc. Bueno, pues en ese capítulo pues vais a ver que hemos hecho como una especie de cronología y de mapeo que esperamos seguir alimentando, profundizando, pero nosotros necesitábamos, ¿no?, aclararnos y poner, como os digo, en el mapa y de manera diacrónica y organizadamente, con esta primera forma de organizar, grupos de hombres y activismo del movimiento de hombres. En el capítulo 5 tenemos el placer de tener a Ander Vergara Sautua, del programa Gizondu, de Conimakunde, del País Vasco, donde le pedimos expresamente, como experto que es y con la trayectoria que ya tiene, que nos hiciese un capítulo de políticas públicas de igualdad específicas para hombres. desde la trayectoria que ellos tienen en Gizondu, queríamos que nos explicaran las reflexiones, fallos, aciertos, errores y las propuestas que desde la práctica que ellos tienen en su grupo pudieran ofrecernos. Con lo cual, creo que es muy, muy interesante para, repito, todas las administraciones locales, autonómicas que quieran abordar en sus políticas públicas el tema de las masculinidades y la igualdad de género. En el capítulo 6, Carmen Ruiz Repullo, profesora ahora en la Universidad de Jaén, socióloga, experta en violencia de género e igualdad y trabajando con chicos y adolescentes y las masculinidades adolescentes, ella nos hizo un capítulo que le pedimos de la pornografía. La pornografía, una escuela de violencia sexual para la masculinidad hegemónica. Creo que es muy sugerente, un tema que sabemos está delante nuestra, que con la pandemia y con el COVID y con Internet, bueno, pues el consumo de pornografía ha sido extraordinario y cómo sigue siendo, ¿no?, una escuela de violencia sexual para las nuevas generaciones de chicos y chicas. Bueno, pues creo que el capítulo merece muchísimo la pena. El capítulo 7 lo han escrito los dos otros coordinadores de estos 4 libros, mis compañeros que he dicho antes, Javier Eloy Martínez de la Universidad de Murcia y Joan Sanfeli de la Universidad de Castellón y Valencia. Ellos se han centrado en la investigación socioantropológica y su aplicabilidad en el estudio de las masculinidades. Poner sobre la mesa lo que venimos trabajando desde hace ya décadas en la antropología y la sociología, quienes trabajamos la igualdad de género y la perspectiva de género y trabajamos con hombres en los proyectos de investigación que vamos desarrollando. El capítulo 8, pues invitamos directamente a nuestro compañero Hilario Sáez de la Fundación Iniciativa Social para que nos contara algunos de los resultados de algunos de los muchos proyectos que sobre hombres están trabajando en Andalucía, en Sevilla, desde su fundación. Bueno, y desde el enfoque sociológico él nos presenta el sistema de discursos sociales de los hombres andaluces sobre las masculinidades. Muy interesante. Y terminamos el capítulo 9 invitando a otro colega, un capítulo a Eric, pescador, Albiach, donde inevitablemente le pedimos al compañero un artículo sobre la coeducación y los programas que él viene desarrollando durante ya más de 20 años, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, coeducando a los hombres, estrategias de trabajo para construir masculinidades desde la igualdad. Es decir, que en este capítulo, que repito, en este libro de la teoría de la acción en busca de masculinidades igualitarias de Dickinson, aquí lo que hacemos es aterrizar en cómo aplicar en la intervención en coeducación, en violencia de género, en el tema de políticas públicas, etcétera, etcétera, el tema los diferentes temas abordados en los 3 libros precedentes sobre la teoría y las reflexiones de las masculinidades con perspectiva de género. Una vez dicho eso, sí que desde el Observatorio de las Masculinidades y nuestro grupo de investigación lo que venimos demandando, y no me canso nunca de decirlo en nombre de todo el equipo, hacen falta muchos más trabajos empíricos. Hacen falta trabajos de investigación con hombres en grupos, en empresas, en comunidades, etcétera, etcétera. Hace falta más tesis doctorales, hacen falta más proyectos de investigación y hace falta no seguir teorizando, sino retroalimentándonos con la empiria, con el trabajo empírico. Sabemos que es un campo de investigación todavía poco abierto, cada vez más, pero poco abierto aún en la universidad. Difícil también de que subvencionen o saquen proyectos o saquen ayudas y demás, pero bueno, lo que sí se está haciendo, estamos haciéndolo con eventos como este y tenéis el Observatorio de las Masculinidades, que es lo que le dije a mi compañera y colega, a Begoña Anguís, ¿no? Bueno, y a Paco Abril y a todo el equipo, aquí sea a todos, ofrecéroslo. O sea, proyectos de investigación que se estén desarrollando, trabajos fin de máster que estén haciendo pues, vuestros alumnos y alumnas, tesis doctorales, publicaciones, etcétera, os agradeceremos mucho que nos lo paséis al Observatorio de las Masculinidades, que no es nuestro, es vuestro, es una herramienta para seguir alimentando y construyendo. Bueno, pues antes de cerrar y no terminar mi tiempo, deciros que estamos también organizando el segundo Congreso de Masculinidades, Género e Igualdad, el segundo CIMAS-C1, que lo vamos a celebrar en octubre del 2022 y que en esta ocasión se va a centrar en la coeducación, directamente la socialización y la coeducación a través de la escuela y a través de los medios de comunicación. Vamos a darle un papel protagonista a estas dos patas que consideramos son básicas, ¿no?, para educar de otra manera, socializar de otra manera a las nuevas generaciones de chicos, de varones, de hombres. Entonces, bueno, creyendo que es la herramienta principal, vamos a darle la importancia que se merece. Ya os pasaremos toda la información, todavía no hemos hecho la publicidad, la haremos ya a partir de octubre. Y bueno, pues aquí tenemos el observatorio, seguimos con nuestros libros, con nuestros conversatorios, animando actividades que hagáis, poder colaborar en todo lo que necesitéis y queremos eso, pasar ya de nuestras redes internacionales de lengua hispana en castellano, pasarlas ya básicamente al inglés. De hecho, el próximo congreso tenemos ponentes ya de habla inglesa, ya veremos de traducción simultánea o no, y estáis desde aquí súper invitados e invitadas. Y ya para el coloquio me podéis preguntar lo que consideréis. ¿Vale, Alexander? ¿Te parece?
Muchísimas gracias, Anastasia. Y muchísimas gracias por esta creación en red y tan aterrizada y que también puede venir unida un poco con el libro y lo que nos va a hablar Custodio Delgado Balbuena, que es profesor titular de Sociología de la Universidad de Sevilla, del Departamento de Sociología, y en su parte activista es miembro de la Red de Hombres por la Igualdad de Men Engage Europe y desde el 2019 es miembro cofundador de Men Engage Iberia, red que integra a organizaciones no gubernamentales, académicas y sociedad civil de España y Portugal en busca de la equidad de género y la implicación de hombres y niños en la equidad de género. Custodio es sociólogo español, académico y activista de larga trayectoria en movimientos a favor de la equidad de género y de la promoción de la participación de hombres y niños, como decíamos, en esta igualdad de género y por esta justicia de género. Docente, investigador y promotor de estudios de género desde una perspectiva feminista y la necesidad de la implicación de los hombres y niños en este proceso a través de la Facultad de Educación y su implementación en la perspectiva de género feminista en los planes de estudio para futuros maestros de primaria y profesores de secundaria y a futuros periodistas a través de temáticas como sociología del género y un seminario sobre género, identidad y masculinidades. Custodio también ha escrito diversos artículos y libros sobre las temáticas que tratamos aquí, como Hombres por la Igualdad de Género en un nuevo escenario social del 2016, Sociología de Género del 2009, o el libro que nos va a presentar hoy, Men's Activists to End Violence Against Women, Voices from Spain, Sweden and UK, de la Bristol University Press, Policy Press, con sus colegas de las universidades de Reino Unido y Suecia, y que, como decía, presentamos hoy aquí. Custodio, todo tuyo y muchísimas gracias por estar.
Buenos días, buenas tardes ya. Hablaré en castellano, hablaré en español. I will speak in Spanish. Sorry for not speaking in English or in whichever language you speak. And I'll try to present this book Alexander has been talking about. I'll use PowerPoint slides. ¿Se me están viendo? ¿Se están viendo las diapositivas?
No.
Vale.
Tienes que compartir pantalla.
Sí, ¿ahora sí?
No.
Sí, aquí va, ya. Vale. No tenemos mucho tiempo y voy a hacer una presentación de un libro que es publicado recientemente, en julio de este año, que se llama Men Activists to End Violence Against Women, Voices from Spain, United Kingdom and Sweden. Y los autores son Nicole Westmoreland, Lena Alchemist, Lynn Egebert Holmgren, Sandy Raston, Stephen Burrell, and myself, Custodio Delgado Balbuena. Está publicado por Bristol University Press. El enlace para poder ser descargado está situado aquí y le pondré en el link abajo. Se puede descargar gratuitamente y también se puede pedir a librerías universitarias o algo parecido. Hemos intentado, es un libro escrito a 6 manos, no ha hecho cada persona un capítulo, sino escrito conjuntamente. Y hemos elaborado y reelaborado hasta que hemos ido construyendo, bueno, en castellano el título es Activismo e implicación de los hombres en contra de las violencias hacia las mujeres, voces desde España, Suecia y Reino Unido. Los autores pertenecen al Departamento de Sociología de la Universidad de Durham. Los autores, 3 de ellos, Nicole Westmoreland, Anne-Lena Sandy Raston y Stephen Burrell. Algunos de ellos a universidades suecas, Anne-Lena Alkvist a Marlander University de Suecia y Linn Egeberg a la Universidad de Uppsala y yo, Custodio Delgado, que pertenezco a la Universidad de Sevilla. Hemos intentado analizar el activismo de hombres implicados en el posicionamiento público en contra de las violencias domésticas y por la equidad de género e intentar verlo empíricamente e intentar compararlo con los diferentes países. A través, digo, de un proceso de reelaboración, lo hemos dejado en 5 capítulos, la necesidad de implicación de los hombres en este proceso, fundamentación teórica, el rationale, becoming involved, el proceso de implicarse, cómo se implican los hombres en este proceso de llegar a estar implicado en contra de las violencias machistas y por la equidad de género, los problemas o las dificultades que provoca o que se dan en el momento de estar implicado y con la idea fundamental de cómo conseguir que más gente, que más niños y más hombres participen en este proceso, de forma que se pueda incrementar el número de hombres que participen en este proceso y de esta forma un poquito reducir las violencias de género y producir equidad. ¿Vale? Planteamos básicamente dos preguntas de investigación. Sería cuáles son los antecedentes personales y las experiencias vitales que se asocian con que algunos hombres tomen posiciones públicas en las que desafían activa y públicamente las violencias de los hombres contra las mujeres y participan activa y públicamente en la equidad de género en una sociedad concreta de las 3 que hemos señalado. Sería un ámbito más personal, más individual. Y una segunda pregunta que sería cuáles serían los factores sociales, políticos, económicos, contextuales que hacen posible y favorecen o dificultan el que más hombres hagan lo mismo, es decir, el que más hombres tomen una posición pública y activa en contra de las violencias machistas y en favor de la equidad de género, y de la justicia de género. Hemos escogido 3 países, España, Suecia y Reino Unido. Voy a hacer un brevísimo resumen de cada uno de los capítulos y dejar un cierto tiempo para luego que haya alguna intervención, preguntas y este tipo de cosas. Hemos escogido 3 países, España, Suecia y Reino Unido. Básicamente, esta selección de países ha estado mediada por una serie de factores, fundamentalmente grupos de hombres activos en todos estos países que activamente trabajan con hombres, incluyendo ONGs o políticas públicas, etcétera, específicas para trabajar con estas temáticas. Y también la pertenencia a diferentes regímenes de estado de bienestar, el régimen socialdemocrático, el régimen liberal, socialdemocrático en el caso sueco, liberal en el caso de United Kingdom y mediterráneo en el caso español. Doy 3 o 4 notas rápidas sobre cada uno de los países y los contextos de los países y de los contextos. En el caso español se produce una existencia de grupos de hombres a partir de los 80, se crea una red, la Red de Hombres por la Igualdad en 2006, que coincide con la primera manifestación pública de hombres en contra de las violencias domésticas. Una primera red que es umbrella o paraguas de otra serie de grupos sociales y la Asociación de Hombres por la Igualdad de Género, AIGE, que confluyen en lo que en Men Engage, en Men Engage Europe y a partir de 2019 en Men Engage Iberia, que integra, tal como decía Alexandre, académicos, organizaciones, instituciones de todo tipo de la sociedad civil, un poquito en búsqueda de la implicación de hombres por la igualdad y por la equidad de género. Tiene sus peculiaridades, como iremos viendo, el caso español, principalmente la preponderancia de la sociedad civil. En el caso del contexto sueco tiene una mayor tradición, tradición en la inclusión de hombres y niños en los esfuerzos para construir la igualdad de género. En este sentido está la organización MAN, que en castellano podríamos decir Hombres por la Igualdad de Género, establecida en 1993. También trabajos de doctorado recientes como el de una coautora de este libro, que es Egeberg Holmgren, sobre hombres jóvenes feministas. También tiene desde 1974, y tenemos aquí con nosotros un ponente sueco, una apuesta fuerte por políticas de parental leave, por intentar producir equidad de género a través de que los hombres desde temprano participen en los cuidados de los hijos, de los niños, que por investigaciones que sabemos es uno de los productores de equidad de género. Otro contexto es el inglés. Un segundito, a ver si... Vale. Otro contexto es el inglés. Parece que no va excesivamente bien esto. ¿Cómo dejo de...? ¿Cómo vuelvo a Valencia? Desde los años 70-80 hay grupos de hombres, hay una conferencia de Londres en 1978, quizás tiene un mayor trabajo académico, y en él participan 3 de los autores del propio libro y se han producido un par de recientes tesis doctorales, una de ellas de uno de los autores del libro, Stephen Burrell, y otra Wright. Analizamos cómo en el primer capítulo analizamos un poquito el marco teórico, la producción científica habida hasta ahora. Yo personalmente, ya que soy quien expone aquí ahora, probablemente creo que es el capítulo que más aporta, o porque orienta la investigación. Está basado básicamente en las investigaciones que se han realizado principalmente en Estados Unidos y en Australia, en autores como Messner, Pérez, Michael Flood, y un poquito que analizan todo el proceso de implicarse y las dificultades que ello tiene para los hombres en pro de la equidad de género. Esa literatura científica está producida básicamente en Estados Unidos y en Australia. Son contextos diferentes. Este sería, que sepamos, el primer estudio un poquito que se aplica con una perspectiva europea, ¿vale? Habíamos puesto antes los capítulos. Perdón, me estoy liando un poquito. No encuentro. En el capítulo 2 analizamos el llegar a estar implicado, cómo los hombres se implican en estos procesos en favor de la equidad de género, ¿vale? Y encontramos dos vías, una principalmente que es básicamente un proceso gradual, y que es la principal forma de implicarse, y que ahora daremos unas pinceladas, y otra que sería un proceso más coyuntural, más momentáneo, que pasamos a analizar igualmente. En el proceso de implicarse, de cómo implicarse, y esto es importante un poquito pues para el diseño de futuras políticas públicas, etcétera, cómo llega un hombre a implicarse, a involucrarse públicamente en contra de las violencias. Encontramos influencias importantes, o la importancia de influencias como en general de las mujeres, madres, abuelas, parejas y otras mujeres de la familia y de la comunidad que un poquito orientan a través de sus demandas y sus apoyos hacia un poquito que los hombres opten por mayor equidad, las experiencias personales de violencia y abuso dentro de la familia, el papel de los tíos, padres, hermanos y tíos, sea por una parte como modelos a seguir o aspectos de su personalidad a seguir, o como en algunos casos antimodelos, como hemos visto en algún caso concreto. También la importancia del haber tenido durante la infancia o durante la etapa de crecimiento un desarrollo de la masculinidad no estándar, alternativo, no hegemónico, no conformista o marginado o algo parecido.
2 minutos, Custodio, perdona.
Sí, perdón.
Si puedes ir cerrando en 2 minutos.
Vale. Voy un poco rápido y lo voy dejando. Hemos encontrado también que existe un proceso menos gradual, que es a través de la influencia de un caso concreto, como sería el caso en España de un caso concreto y destacado de violencia masculina contra las mujeres, como el caso de Ana Orantes en España en 1997, o el caso de Sarah Everard en United Kingdom en este mismo año. Otra vía es cómo una persona es catapultada en esta implicación a través de una tragedia personal, y una vía que hemos encontrado que cada vez es más frecuente, que sería el empleo o la vía profesional como vía de entrada, es decir, sectores que en principio no tenían una especial afinidad sobre estas temáticas, se topan con la violencia sistemática de una forma tan fuerte, que necesariamente toman una opción por analizar, investigar, etcétera, estas violencias machistas, como puede ser policías, médicos, doctores, etcétera. En el siguiente capítulo vemos algunas de las dificultades del proceso de estar implicado, tensiones con los grupos de las mujeres, riesgos, el que los hombres se apoderen de mayor espacio, el hecho de poner a los hombres en un pedestal, el efecto pedestal, es decir, cuando los hombres hablan parecen que tienen mayor audiencia que las mujeres, necesidad de hacer una vuelta atrás, importancia de que los hombres destaquen el trabajo, el conocimiento y el proyecto de sus compañeras. Voy rapidísimo para que nos dé tiempo a otros posibles riesgos, el hablar pero no hacer, falta de autorreflexión antes de involucrarse en estos procesos. También costes personales en las personas, en los varones que se implican en estos procesos, el ser considerado como un traidor de género en los ámbitos familiares. La importancia de los grupos de hombres, por ejemplo, en el caso español es especialmente privilegiado, como vía privilegiada para entrar en el cuestionamiento de la masculinidad hegemónica, entablar redes de apoyo, amistades, debatir cuestiones de género y masculinidades y emprender acciones políticas. Manifestaciones políticas y públicas que en España, por ejemplo, tiene mayor visibilidad, manifestaciones de hombres en contra de estas violencias, manifestaciones, marchas, demostraciones, ruedas de hombres, etcétera. También últimamente vemos consecuencias negativas y serían riesgos, una deriva y vínculos con las políticas de extrema derecha, con un etnonacionalismo y con lo que llamamos manósfera, con el ámbito, en el ámbito de Internet, de cara a implicar a más hombres. ¿Qué sectores donde se dan más este tipo de sectores? Hombres jóvenes políticamente activos que forman parte de otros movimientos por la igualdad. En general, hombres en grupos políticos de cualquier individuo con experiencia en la discriminación es más propenso a tomar una postura en contra de otras formas. Sector de servicios sociales, educación, la atención médica, entornos en los que se valora la empatía y el cuidado de los demás. Y paso un poquito a la experiencia de la desigualdad de los hombres. Puede ser un desafío para involucrar, por ejemplo, a hombres de clase trabajadora o hombres que experiencian racismo, islamofobia, etc. La educación como clave, educación desde la infancia, desde la más tierna infancia, educación en el ámbito educativo propiamente dicho y también en otros ámbitos no propiamente educativos como pueden ser lugares de trabajo y el papel de los sindicatos en este sitio. También aprovechar ciertos ciclos vitales como el convertirse en padre, en tener hijos, que son momentos en que la gente se cuestiona sus valores de género, tener en consideración los discursos de equidad de género que a veces desmovilizan. Si ya todos somos iguales, ¿para qué vamos a hacer nada? Y la importancia que a partir del fenómeno del Me Too a nivel internacional y que en España han tenido el Me Too, el juicio de la manada y las manifestaciones feministas del 8M, y posteriores. El 75% en la encuesta está de acuerdo con que el Me Too había destacado el acoso sexual y alentado a más hombres a hablar en su país. En España tenemos, especialmente esto en Suecia y en Reino Unido, en España tenemos el caso de nuestro Me Too particular, un poquito a través del juicio de la manada, el 8M, las manifestaciones feministas, etc. Todo esto ha producido que se produzca un fortísimo debate público y una enorme demanda. Demanda de cambio por parte de las mujeres y de implicación de los hombres. Como conclusiones, un poquito, encontramos que lo que hallamos, nuestros hallazgos respaldan las investigaciones anteriores, por ejemplo, la importancia del tener una trayectoria a lo largo del ciclo vital no acorde con las expectativas masculinas al crecer, la influencia de las mujeres en que los hombres tomen un impulso para implicarse en procesos de equidad, la relevancia de las vías profesionales, que cada vez es más importante. También hemos encontrado nuevas ideas o preguntas, por ejemplo, las diferencias entre involucrarse gradualmente y ser catapultados por un suceso particular, como el caso español de Ana Orantes o el inglés de Ana Everland, en este caso serían procesos individuales o procesos globales, como en general el Me Too o el juicio de la manada de Pamplona y los movimientos de 11M, etcétera, en los casos españoles. También hemos aprendido un poquito la necesidad de aprender de y comprometerse con otros movimientos sociales, por ejemplo, Black Lives Matter, movimientos medioambientales, fundamentalmente, sindicalistas, y la necesidad de tener unas perspectivas más transnacionales por una parte y locales por otra. Y dos palabras más, y yo personalmente señalaría de esto, aparte de que ahí está el libro, como aportaciones que encuentro en el libro, un marco teórico completo y actualizado. Señalaría la importancia de los testimonios literarios de los hombres entrevistados. No es un libro que conjuga elementos académicos y también de la vida cotidiana. Los testimonios literarios de las personas entrevistadas a veces da gusto leerlo. La complejidad y también lo que aporta el ser un trabajo internacional, señala similitudes, diferencias de las diferentes sociedades estudiadas, formas de organizarse, produce riqueza. También la escalabilidad, es decir, capacidad y posibilidad de ampliar y aplicar a otros países y contextos el marco teórico y la metodología utilizada para analizar en otras sociedades. Y como queda, y necesidad de implicación de las instituciones públicas, de los poderes públicos en el cambio de las normas de género de la sociedad y más específicamente de los varones hacia unas normas de género más igualitarias, más feministas, más acordes al derecho y a los derechos humanos y a lo que nos vienen demandando el movimiento feminista desde hace 300 años. ¿Vale? Con eso cerraría.
Muchas gracias, Custodio.
O lo que sea. Disculpa si me he extendido un poquito.
Sí, bueno, nos hemos ido pasando un poco de tiempo, también hemos tenido los problemas del inicio, tenemos 5 minutos, no sé si hay alguna intervención tanto aquí en el público como en internet, que en el streaming, que estoy viendo las preguntas, o sea, si alguien las tiene. Si no cerramos, nos vamos a comer porque ya va también siendo hora. Well,
puedo poner el link para descargar el libro si alguien quiere, ¿vale? Lo puedo poner aquí en el chat, ¿vale? Por si
Claro, muchísimas gracias.
está.
Well, just thank all of you. Thank also to Paul. Thank you also to Martin for being here. I was saying that we almost run out of time, and there are like, I think there are not questions because we are very hungry, because here is lunchtime and I think we need a rest right now. So thank you everyone for being here, and see you in the afternoon after the lunch. Thank you. Moltes gràcies. Gràcies.
Gracias.
Gracias.
Gracias. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
If you have... Okay.